The empire has written us for centuries before we began writing back to the empire. Despite our defiance and insistence to be heard, written, or seen, the oppositional model of the empire and its other colors are reading of the pre-colonial past in which complex cultural exchanges are replaced by claims of cultural purity and alien disruption. South-South dialogue, renegotiating the pedagogy and praxis of postcolonialities, thus aims to encourage conversations around postcoloniality, moving from opposition to plurality. South-South dialogues recognize, even encourage other acts of writing. Writing to, writing across, writing over, writing together. Thus, as we navigate through differences, we also locate sites of similarities, contingencies, formulate new grounds for alliances, and we devise new strategies of reading and writing. South-South dialogues, therefore, is a discourse of differences and similarities, to forge new meanings and to rewrite our own selves. Thus, we would like to mark the first day of proceedings of the South-South Dialogues, the two-day international webinar organized by the Departments of English, SNDTWU Women's University, Mumbai, and Sir Gurudas Mahavidyalaya, University of Calcutta. Organizing a conference, as we all know, specifically a virtual conference, would not have been possible without the support and best wishes of a lot of people, especially our respective patrons. Despite the fact that they are unable to be virtually present here with us today, both the Vice Chancellor of SNDT Women's University, Professor Shashikala Vanjari, and the Principal of Sir Gurudas Mahavidyalaya, Dr. Manishankar Roy, have sent us their best wishes to make this a successful event. Before we commence the proceedings for the evening, I would like to request our conference attendees to please mute your microphones. I think all of you are doing that already, to help the virtual presentations to be as clear and as noise-free as possible. We are recording this and we will make it available upon request. If you would like to ask questions from our presenters, please send in your questions via the chat box or the chat option available to you in your Google Meet platform. To begin the dialogues, let me cordially invite the respective heads of the departments for this event. Dr. Manisha Ghatage, Head, Department of English, SNDT Women's University. Dr. Paramita Haldar, Head, Department of English, Sir Gurudas Mahavidyalaya. And Dr. Prabha Manoratna, Head, Department of English, University of Kelaniya, Sri Lanka, to start the conversation, to start the dialogue. Dr. Manisha, over to you.
Thank you, Shashi. Good evening and welcome all. SNDT Women's University is the first women's university in India as well as in South Asia. The university was founded by the great social reformer Bharat Ratna Maharishi Karve in 1916 for a noble cause of women education with the mission empowerment of women through education and motto an enlightened woman is the source of infinite strength. SNDT Women's University is synonymous with the women's education globe. The university carries unique features of catering needs of students from kindergarten to PhD programs with multidisciplinary approach. I would like to give brief history of the department. The Department of English is established in 1979. The aim is to teach literature with perspectives and methodologies that will enable students to critically evaluate not just the text they study, but also the world they live in. The department developed uniquely. It is evolved in the field of language teaching and literature. In 80s, the department worked intensely in the area of second language teaching and curriculum development and designed need-based courses for undergraduate women. Then expanded expertise in the area of Canadian studies by establishing Center for Canadian Studies. Currently, we are moved by the movement, the Black Lives Matter. The department introduced in 90s Black feminism and literature. Then it progressed further by adding different areas of study such as translation, comparative literature, and global south, both theories and literary texts. We encourage research work in contemporary writing with fresh perspectives such as postcolonial, feminist, comparative, and culture studies. The MA program has a research component in the 3 semesters of study. The curriculum is designed with the objective of functionalizing and contemporizing with case studies. Seminar style teaching with a continuous assessment through presentation and projects are encouraged. SNDT Women's University follows a research based curriculum, introduces analytical thinking and critical perspectives in schools. Research at the university is conducted both at the master's and the postgraduate level. The range and focus of the dissertation and thesis gives a sense of diversity and futuristic cutting edge research prospects at the department. The department tried to initiate the dialogue with the other universities. Last year, we collaborated with the Pondicherry University and organized national level seminar on the topic Digital Humanities in India, Theory and Application. This year, we are collaborating with Sir Gurudas Mahavidyalaya, University of Calcutta, with active support from Dr. Prabha, Dr. Shashikala from Department of University of Colonial, Sri Lanka. Thank you. Over to you, Shashi.
Thank you, Dr. Manisha. I would like Dr. Paramita to continue the conversation by giving us a bit of background.
Yes, thank you, Shashikala. Am I audible? Am I
Yes,
audible?
yes, you
Yes.
are. Yes.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. As the principal of our institution is in a medical emergency, firstly, I, on behalf of him and our institution, Sir Gurudas Mahavidyalaya, want to thank my colleagues, especially our colleagues from SNDTWU Women's University, for collaborating with us, for making this great effort to arrange the two-day international webinar, and especially to thank the resource persons for taking time out of their busy schedule to be here with us today and encouraging us in this initiative. A few lines should be said on our institution. Well, ours is an undergraduate college under the ambit of the University of Calcutta in the state of West Bengal, India. Our institution is located at the easternmost fringes of Kolkata, and we cater to students not only from the metropolitan but also from partially industrial and largely rural areas of the easternmost part of our country. Students who belong, a large section of who come from socio-economically weaker section of the society. This is also a very difficult time for us. We are all going through many hardships, and our students are also in different types of hardships. And in this time, I thank everyone associated with this seminar to keep their academic interest buoyant, especially as the head of the Department of English. I'd like to thank on behalf of our students who would be able to listen to such great academicians speaking on a topic which they, as students of literature, as students of social science, ought to be initiated in at this stage. We are here today from this cognomen of countries that labored under colonial rule and got independence almost at the same time. And we share similar patterns of emerging nationalist politics, dominant class political alliance, and resulting marginal class coalitions. In ethnopolitics also, we are all at crossroads. On one hand, our states are beset with numerous ethnic conflicts and movements whose demands range from basic socio-economic and political rights to regional autonomy to outright secession, fight for independence, and we know some of these conflicts have generated tremendous human sufferings and have bogged down the state's credibility and security apparatus. Our literature has also been a continuous effort to voice these tensions, a continuous effort to write back. Literary theory has also ranged from colonialism to postcolonialism onto these continuous hybrid flux. So we are here split between the urge to forge a communality and solidarity based on our colonial past and the need to affirm our individual differences, our independent movement, our individualistic colonial experience, and their impact on our literature and theory. So here we have come together for a dialogue on our country's common subsisting heritage and also the unique pathology each country embodies. As our concept note says, as Shashi has read out, while Global South is projected as a developmental paradigm, any unilateral tendency of development not only tend to override regional, local life forms, but can also evoke tensions unknown before. My young colleagues have chosen this as the area of today's talk as sort of a parallel of the South-South cooperation forged on plurality as we aspire to open this dialogue of differences and similarities, to share knowledge today, to build understandings, and in the process, we also want to rewrite our own selves. As I'm equally excited as our students to listen to the eminent speakers, I will end here today, hoping and praying that everything goes without hitch and praying for a smooth running of everyone's internet connection. Thank you. Happy listening.
Thank you, Dr. Paramita. May I invite Dr. Prabha to continue the conversation and also to please invite the first panel of speakers after her preamble. Thank you very much. Prabha, your mic is on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry. Yes. Sorry once again for the drop in my internet connection. I hope it will go smoothly this time. I want to thank Dr. Shashikala Asala for inviting me for this very important intervention in the way we think about literature and literary studies, and also the larger politics of the kind of higher education that we are involved in. I want to thank all of the organizers, and I'm so happy to see all of you here. Let me very briefly introduce the kind of work that we do at the University of California. I am the head of the Department of English at the University of California, and it's a very exciting time for us right now because we are really trying to reconceptualize the way we think of our degree programs and our higher education, what we offer in terms of higher education. The English department at California offers a taught undergraduate course, as well as MPhil, several MPhils. We don't have a taught master's course, but we do have students who register for Master of Philosophy degrees. So for us, the way we think of literature has evolved in the last 60 years or so since the inception of our department. As we all know, most English departments begin as a conversation with the global north. But since the emergence of postcolonial literature and postcolonial theory, there has been an increasing presence of the need to not only take postcolonialism, which takes the West as a kind of a framework um, to think about literature and culture and politics in general, but also to look at other possible frameworks for doing that. Now, postcolonial theory has been the kind of the dominant paradigm for a very long time at the English department in Calgary, as in most other English departments across the global South. But slowly we are trying to rethink what that means for us and how we can transform our thinking and our theory and our practice into other areas. So in that spirit, I think this is a very timely conversation for us to have and to reinterrogate what it means to have a South-South dialogue. And I think when we say a South-South dialogue, it involves, first of all, a dialogue within our own cultural context, within our own country, for that matter. As most other South Asian countries, we have several languages, 3 main languages and other varieties of those languages, and we have literature and cultural work going on in all 3 languages. So one of the areas that we've progressively been working on is to look at the dialogue between the texts that happen in those languages. And the other level at which I think we can approach the question of a South-South dialogue is, of course, to think of the regional level. And in that, the South Asian and also more broadly, the Asian level. And in the spirit of these two ways of looking at a South-South dialogue, we've introduced several courses. Some have been there for a while, but we have been trying to update them to reflect the way that we are engaging with our own societies rather than speaking back to the empire or the global north. So one exciting course that our students are very interested in is a course called Global Literatures in Translation. So we look at global literature. It's a truly global course, but it also has literature written in local languages, written in other regional languages. So for us, that is one thing that we are constantly sort of trying to come to terms with, to sort of understand what that means. The other, I think, the big framework for thinking about South-South dialogue is also to think of the South not just in terms of a regional South, but also a political South, which then involves women of color in the first world, and all kinds of marginalized communities across the world. So we offer courses such as diversity politics, courses in gender, courses in ideology, various courses that use this framework of communities and literatures that engage with things other than the fact of the empire, that and use frameworks that are not limited to the ones that are developed in the West. And for us, that's really exciting. I could give you several examples, but for us, along those lines, I think our pedagogy needs to address this question of what it really means to teach or learn literature in English, literatures of English within a South Asian, within a Sri Lankan context. So for us, that's also the pedagogical aspect of it is also a very important conversation for us to really think about our reality, and I'm sure that is your reality as well, where we have various frameworks of measurement implemented on us, often dictated by Western donor agencies. So we are very conscious of that, and we are conscious of the kind of paradigm they offer. And lastly, we are also pushing towards emphasizing the integration between theory, practice, and policy. This is the last kind of trend that we see in how we are designing our courses, how we can bring both theory and practice within a southern, or rather from a southern perspective, which then links to both national policy but also international policies, such as the UN, or even things like inclusive education, diversity, the kind of the more global conversation that is happening, which is not necessarily focused on responding to Western frameworks, I don't want to use the word Western because I think that's a rather misleading term. In any case, so those are the exciting things that we are trying to work out right now. Not that we have worked out everything, but that's the kind of the direction we are going in. So I just wanted to give you a sense of what we do in the department. I think it is now time to introduce the academic session, which is beginning shortly. There are three panelists on this session. Let me introduce them to you. Dr. Saugata Bhaduri will speak first. Dr. Bhaduri is professor at the Center for English Studies, JNU. His expansive and eclectic areas of research and teaching interests include the colonial and literary history of Bengal, contemporary literary and cultural theory, and popular culture studies. His latest book, published in 2020, is Polycoloniality, in which he probes into how postcolonialities should be renegotiated on grounds of plurality. I think it's a very exciting term, and we are all looking forward to hear you speak. Next, Dr. Hebsiba Israel will be speaking. Dr. Israel is a senior lecturer in Translation Studies, University of Edinburgh. Her current research interests include translation and religion, literary translation, literary practice, and translation in South Asia. From 2014 to 17, she led the AHRC-funded research project under their Translating Cultures theme, focusing on the role of translation in the movement of religious concepts across languages and the ways in which this impacts religious conversion and autobiographical writing about conversion experiences. Her monograph, titled Religious Transactions in Colonial South India, offers an analysis of the translated Bible as an object of cultural transfer in South Asia in the context of evolving attitudes to translation in Tamil sacred landscapes from the 18th century onwards. She has guest edited with John Zavos a special section on Indian traditions of life writing on religious conversion for the Journal of South Asia, and a special issue with Matthias Friends titled Translation and Religion for the journal Religion. She is currently guest editing a special issue of Translation Studies focusing on translation and multilingualism in India. Thirdly, Dr. Ipshita Chanda will be speaking to us on this panel. Dr. Chanda is a professor of comparative literature at the Department of Comparative Literature, the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. She received her PhD from Javadpur University, Calcutta, and taught at the Department of Comparative Literature at the Javadpur University from 1993 to 2017. Her areas of interest include theory of literature, comparative literature, and Indian language literatures. She was professor of Indian culture as Indian Council of the Cultural Relations Chair at Georgetown University, Washington, D.C. From 2013 to 14. Her publications include Packaging Freedom, Feminism and Popular Culture, Tracing the Charit as a Genre, an exploration in comparative literature methodology, and Selfing the City, Single Women Migrants and Their Lives in Kolkata. And as co-editor, locating cultural change, theory, method, process, and shaping the discourse, women's writing in Bengali periodicals from 1865 to 1947. She translates between Hindi, Bangla, Urdu, and English. It is clearly a very distinguished panel with a set of very exciting speakers. And moderating today's session would be Dr. Shinjini Basu, who will now take over from me and continue with the academic session. Thank you very much once again for having me here this evening.
Thank you, Prabha, for that wonderful introduction. You sort of set the stage for our business of the day. So without much delay, I would ask Dr. Bhaduri to deliver his lecture. His topic, his title for his lecture is Polycolonial Dialogues, Renegotiating Postcolonialities, Forging South-South Solidarities. But before anything else, I think all of you will be listening to the lectures attentively. Please, as Shashi told you before, please post your questions in the chat box. And I guess we will take up the questions when we go into a discussion after all the three speakers speak. So, and as she has also mentioned, please keep your mics muted and videos also switched off. So over to Professor Bhaduri.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'd like to thank Shinjini, Drupadi and Shashikala from Gurudas Mahavidyalaya, SNDTWU University and University of Kelaniya respectively for thinking of me and inviting me for this conference. I have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm not sure how this works because this is the first time I'm doing it, but I presume it can be done. So I'll just start and right, I hope it will happen. I mean, that is my presumption. I am audible, right?
Yes, sir, you are.
Yeah, right. So I'll just... is my presentation visible?
Yes, sir, it is.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. I never thought it would be. So you can actually see like a PowerPoint presentation, right?
Yes,
like
yes,
a screen. Oh, wonderful.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So anyway, so the title has already been read out, so I will not waste time on it. But definitely, I mean, since this conference wants to talk about renegotiating post-colonial pedagogy and practice with the objective of South-South dialogue, South-South solidarities, I thought that I could present a bit on my own current and recent research, which is polycoloniality, because I do believe that polycolonial dialogues can be a means to do the same. But to begin with, why do we need South-South cultural solidarities? Because that is a very important point. I mean, it's almost axiomatic that we must have South-South solidarities, but why? That is because I believe that, first of all, we have our entangled histories and our own being ushered into colonial modernities, being colonized across the global south. So whether it be in Latin America, whether it be in Africa, whether it be in Asia, they do have these shared entangled histories and which we naturally need to know about rather than our own insular, very national histories. But more importantly, I think that currently, since the global south has been defined also in economic terms, and the global south necessarily has to combat current global multinational capitalism, new imperialism, and to alter global alliances, if at all the global south has to survive. So all the more we need such South-South cultural solidarities to be able to forge these alliances. And at a third level, and even more importantly, the current emergent trends of new fascisms, sectarianisms, fundamentalisms, and it's not that it doesn't plague the global north, but it is particularly dangerous in the global south, and even in the global north, the ones who are at the receiving end of these fascisms are often citizens of the global south. So all the more there is a need for all of us to come together to resist and counter and combat these fundamentalisms, communalisms, new fascisms. So I believe on all these three grounds, we need to have South-South cultural solidarities. So far, so good. But what is stopping us then? I mean, why not? So let's have South-South solidarities. What's the problem? The problem, in my opinion, is precisely what I call the post-colonial common sense. And that is why we need to renegotiate post-coloniality, as this conference itself sets out to do, and as I will provide a particular template for. Now, what is this post-colonial common sense? And why is it stopping us from having a meaningful South-South dialogue, a meaningful South-South solidarity? Because first of all, the post-colonial common sense presumes a mono-nationality for each colonial encounter. So commonsensically, we think that India was colonized only by the British, or Brazil was colonized only by the Portuguese, or Indonesia was colonized only by the Dutch, just to name three major populous global South nations. But clearly, once you have such a mono-national understanding of colonial encounters, you evidently tend to focus therefore more on the terrestrial loci of such colonization, and even your resistive ideologies also have a mono-national basis. I'll just come to it in a minute. Rather than talking about the very entangled, often oceanic relations with intersections, the trade routes, the very intersective, multiple, multinational, plurinational connections of colonialism are often ruled out of the general discourse of post-colonial common sense. And accordingly, what happens is that we only form monolingual blocks. So even when we do talk about South-South literatures or South-South literatures, we generally tend to become linguistically specific. So for instance, the three countries represented in this conference, India, Sri Lanka, and Kenya, I did see a speaker from Kenya also who will speak tomorrow. All these three are Anglophone countries. So we can have Anglophonic blocks like Commonwealth literature, or similarly Francophonic blocks or Lusophonic blocks. But the possibility of a comparatist intersections amongst these blocks becomes impossible, because the post-colonial common sense and the empire writing back, etc. Discourse generally presumes a mono-national colonialism. So only the British colonized us, and therefore we focus only on that mono-national history. And this focus on mono-nationalism, this focus on mono-national imperialism also stops us from developing a vocabulary that is adequate to theorize contemporary multinational imperialism, because contemporary new imperialism is clearly multinational. And our post-colonial common sense driven vocabulary is so mono-national that we have not even developed an adequate vocabulary to be able to counter contemporary multinational new imperialism. So the South-South solidarities aimed towards combating contemporary multinational new imperialism becomes an impossibility, becomes a non-starter, because our vocabulary is so mono-national. Our vocabulary, which has come through post-colonial common sense, is so mono-national that we do not have adequate words and terms and concepts to deal with this plurality, to deal with this multinational new imperialism. And furthermore, because of the mono-nationalistic thrust in post-colonial common sense, resistance is also visualized through insular nationalisms, mono-nationalisms, and possibly therefore jingoism, xenophobia, binaristic Manichaeanisms, and resultantly communal fascism also. So binarisms resulting out of such monisms also impedes a possible combating, which I stated is one of the agendas of South-South solidarities, a possible combating of new fascism also. So post-colonial common sense, which is mono-national, a mono-national understanding of territorial coloniality, is what really stops us from having a meaningful South-South dialogues. So what is the way out? And herein, this is just a proposal that has kind of selfishly emerged from my own obsessions. But in my opinion, if we have polycolonial dialogues, if we have a template that tries to view imperialism itself as a multiple project, as a multinational project, then we are likely to be able to fulfill the mandate that I set out right at the beginning for South-South solidarities. But what is polycoloniality? And in my book, which has just been mentioned, I talk about polycoloniality, which is precisely that erstwhile colonization. So not just contemporary new imperialism, but erstwhile colonization also was not really by one nation. It was rather a collaborative and a collective project by multiple European powers simultaneously. And even the resultant colonial modernity, therefore, that emerged from the individual colonial nations was a multiple project. And this is roughly the idea of polycoloniality, that coloniality itself was multiple. Thus, and to go back to my old question of, let's say, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, which are Francophone, or Brazil, which is Lusophone, or Indonesia, which are Dutch colonies, or China even, which is still considered part of the global South, which had Japanese imperialism. So all these, which were, so whether parts of the global South were incidentally colonized majorly by just the English, or just the Portuguese, or just the Spanish, or just the Dutch, etc., if we have this polycolonial dialogue, we can possibly have this shared, entangled history of our interpellation. And similarly, as I have already suggested, it follows, I'm being repetitive here, polycoloniality, or viewing colonialism in multiple terms, also allows for a vocabulary that allows us to read imperialism in multinational terms, and therefore makes it more adequate for combating our current states of imperialism. And it also takes us, since we are talking about hybridity, we are talking about multiplicity, we are talking about plurality, it also takes us beyond Manichaeanisms, beyond insular nationalisms, and resistance also becomes non-sectarian, pluricultural, and therefore possibly leading to the combating of even communal fascism, even new sectarianisms that are emerging. And therefore my suggestion is that if we have a polycolonial template and we renegotiate post-colonialism, renegotiate our post-colonial practices, our post-colonial pedagogies on a polycolonial template, we might be able to make possible South-South solidarities beyond such linguistic, religious, cultural differences. So that being said, how do we frame this polycolonial template? Now, the polycolonial template that I have, of course, is from Bengal, because that is what I've studied. But I'm sure that talking about the three hosts, at least, of this particular conference, not just Gurudas Mahavidyalaya, which is located in Bengal, but Bombay has its own polycolonial history, which is clear, Portuguese, British, and of course, Sri Lanka has its own polycolonial history with the Dutch very majorly. But I will focus in the remainder of my presentation on the Bengal experience to be able to frame what I call this polycolonial template. So, as far as polycoloniality in Bengal is concerned, now, Bengal was, of course, colonized majorly by the English. We all know that. That is the common sense. We focus only on the English. And the English were first there by 1650. And first there as in first colony. I mean, the English were there. Ralph Fitch was in Bengal in 1580 itself as a visitor, as a traveler, writing back. But I'm not talking about that. Their first colony was in Hooghly in 1650. And till 1947, of course. And they were in some parts of India from as early as 1612, some parts as a colonial presence, in Surat to be precise. Their first colony was in 1612. But Bengal was also colonized by the Portuguese. And from 1514 right up to 1797, and actually till 1869, they had some administrative powers in at least one pocket in Bandel. By the Dutch also, who had colonies in Bengal from 1623 to 1825. And in some parts of India from even before that. The French who were in Bengal, who had colonies in Bengal from 1673 to 1950. The Danish who had their colonies in Bengal, who had their colony in Bengal from 1698 to 1845. And in some parts of India from even before that and even after that. The Germans, and I'm using the word Germans very loosely because actually the Austrians and the Prussians, Germany was not a consolidated, so linguistically German, let's say. So the Austrians who had a colony in Bengal from 1723 to 1794, and the Prussians who had a colony in Bengal from very short-lived, 1753 to 1760. The Swedes, and who actually did not have a settled colony, but who had a formal colonial trade with Bengal from 1731 to 1811. And even the Greeks, who are not really a national presence, but a colonial presence nevertheless, and whose dates are therefore difficult to ascertain. But anyway, so we have to focus on this plurality, the plural history. I'll brush through the next few slides very fast because we do not have the time to go into a detailed history of each of these colonial presences. But let us suffice to say that the Portuguese were in Bengal from the beginning of the 16th century, and their first colony was in 1514 in Hijli, and thereafter they also colonized other parts of Bengal, and their major colonial setup began in the Shadgaon, Hooghly, Shadgaon, Hooghly, Bandel belt from 1536 onwards, and so on and so forth. In 1632, they were defeated comprehensively by Shah Jahan, but Shah Jahan himself permitted them to resettle again in Bandel, which was their last autonomous colony, and which were there till 1797, and they did have some powers in Bandel till as late as 1869. Similarly, the Dutch, and I'll move through these, I'll just brush through these slides, and those who are interested can look it up, and even the slide, you can just look at the slide and you can see rather than me having to read it out all. So the Dutch East India Company was formed in 1602, and their exploration started in Bengal by 1615, but their first factory in Bengal was 1623, and their first colony was only after the Portuguese were ousted from Hooghly in 1632, and they held on to Hooghly Chinsura, which became their major colony. The Hooghly Chinsura thing they held on. And what is also important is, and this I just missed out mentioning in my previous slide, that in the fifth point in my I've gone over to my previous slide, that the Portuguese also set up an establishment in what is today's Kolkata. In Betor, in Howrah, actually, in the environs of today's Kolkata. Similarly, the Dutch also, and I am now in my first, second, third, fourth, fifth bulleted point in this current slide. The Dutch also set up one of their colonies in Boranagar, in North Kolkata, today's North Kolkata, which is before the so-called establishment of Kolkata. But I'll come to it in a minute. And they lost their colonies now and then. And finally, in 1824, they signed a treaty to give up all their holdings in the Indian subcontinent, all their holdings in South Asia, including those in Sri Lanka, in exchange for all British holdings in Indonesia. So there was almost an exchange of enclaves, so that the Dutch could have exclusive control over Indonesia and the English could have exclusive control over South Asia. But that being said, the French also similarly, in fact, I'm spending too much time on these historical data. But anyway, the French company was formed in 1642, and their colony in Chandernagore, that was officially established in 1688, and they held on to it even after the British, and it's only in 1950 that Chandernagore was amalgamated within the Indian Union. The Danish, similarly, whom I've also talked about, they incidentally never had a formal permission, unlike the other colonies. So they would kind of work surreptitiously, almost in a demi-colonial way, but nevertheless, they set up a couple of colonies, Gondalpara to begin with, and Srirampur majorly thereafter. By the mid-18th century, they had this colony of Srirampur, which they held on to till 1845, when they ceded it to the British. And the Germans, I talked about both the Austrians and the Prussians. The Austrians, actually Belgians under Austrian rule, more like it. But the Austrians had a colony in Bengal, which is just north of today's Barakpur, in what is Bakipur, Ichapur. Ichapur, the name today exists today also. Bakipur, the village has slipped into oblivion. But Bakipur, Ichapur is a contiguous belt just north of Barakpur. That is where they had their colony, and they held on to their colony from 1720. I mean, intermittently, they kind of lost control for a few decades in the mid-18th century, etc. But in 1723 to 1794, William Boldt, whom we'll come to later in this presentation, becomes a very important figure in the Austrian colonial enterprise in Bengal. The Prussians, similarly, the Prussian king, he established in 1753 a Bengal company called the Bengalische Handelsgesellschaft, and which had a very short-lived demi-colony, I call it again, which was called Prussian Gardens, which was around today's Bhadrashwar. And for a very brief period of 7 years, they held on to it. The Swedes, as I said, they did not have a settled colony, but the Swedish East India Company was set up in 1731, and they conducted trade for 80 long years with Bengal, and they somehow chose to be an itinerant maritime colonial nation rather than having a colony, though they did have an offer from the French to set up a settlement in Karaikal, which is, as we know, in today's Tamil. It's part of the Puducherry UT, but whatever. And finally, the Greeks, as I said, the Swedish were curious because they were colonizers without a colony. But the Greeks were even more curious. They were colonial presences in Bengal with a colony in Bengal, but without a nation. because till 1832, what we understand as Greece today was part of the Turkish Empire, but the Greeks settled in Bengal from early 17th century, as we know, and they had one exclusive settlement, let's call it an enclave, not really a colony, in Rishra, which is just a few kilometers south of Srirampur, and they stayed on till pretty much within the 20th century. Now, so far so good. This was the brief history of polycolonial presences in Bengal, but I need to focus more on what was the outcome. And the outcome, as I've already said, colonial modernity. That is how Bengal gets ushered into colonial modernity. That also, as I would argue, was not an English product at all. So commonsensical historiography suggests that Bengal apparently got ushered into Bengal Renaissance and print and Western education and what else you have, decolonizing thoughts, reforms by the English. But that's not true at all. And I would instead argue for polycolonial modernity, and where I have identified 7 registers, and which I'll briefly touch upon one after the other. And across these 7 registers, first, a definitive impact of the colonizer's language on colonized language and literature. Second, in terms of the colonizer's influence on non-literary cultural forms, also like visual and performance arts. Third, exposure, giving exposure to the colonized nation to urban cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism, hybridity, diaspora. Fourth, introducing the colonized nation to Western, institutionalized Western education, particularly higher education. Fifth, introducing print as a dominant medium. Six, introducing progressive social and political reforms like banning of sati, and we understand, and introducing democratic reforms, etc. And seven, even the creation of the possibility of resistance and revolution and decolonization. All of these, as I would argue, were induced in Bengal, not by the English, but by other powers. So to move very fast to my first register, which is language and literature, we would see that English influence on Bengali language is often of a foreign kind. Even the loan words from English we can identify as foreign. Whereas Portuguese influence on Bengal is so deep that some words which we think are absolutely Bengali words, like bashon for utensil, or balti for bucket, or janla for window, or shaya for petticoat, these are actually Portuguese words. So the Portuguese influence on Bengali language.
Hello, sir. I think there is something wrong with your audio mic.
Yeah, I think we lost, sir.
Yeah. Sir, are you here?
I think perhaps you should call him.
Okay. Okay.
You know, because clearly we can't hear him.
There must be some issue. I just call him. He is again coming back. must be some issue with his connection. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Very good, very good, very good. So I'm very sorry about this, and this is what happens with.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Sir, you could move on. Yeah. You're here. You're here. The previous slide, sir. You are there. Language. Yes, sir.
Hello,
Yes, sir.
can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, wonderful. And you could see the presentation also, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so I'll just start again. I'm really sorry about this, and I hope this time it would. Oh, so it is presenting, right? You can
Yes, yes, yes.
you can see my screen currently?
Yes, absolutely. We can.
Okay, okay. I'll just move over to the very fast. Yeah, right. No, so I was talking about the. Oops, sorry. Yeah, right. I was talking about the influence on language and literature. So what I was talking, I
Yes,
just
here. You're here.
mentioned that even in literature, the influence of the presence of the Portuguese and the Dutch is much more significant, much more foundational in Bengali literature from the 16th to the 18th century. And even the first piece of prose writing, and therefore the introduction of Bengal to a new register of writing rather than verse, which is prose, that was a Portuguese product, a particular religious tract which was translated by Father Dominic de Souza in 1599. And the first book-length prose work was also a Portuguese product, which is the 1660s Brahman Roman Catholic Sangbad by Dom Antonio de Rosario. So this I had already talked about, and this is where I must have got stuck. So now I am audible, right?
Yes, sir, you are.
Okay, so let me move on to the second register, which is the polycolonial influence on visual and performative cultures. So even in visual arts, by the second quarter of the 19th century, we find this very interesting phenomenon emerge in Bengal, which was known as Dutch Bengal art, and sometimes also referred to as French Bengal art, where after the diminution of the influence of Mughal miniature, so European artists and native artists were commissioned by wealthy merchants to form a new idiom of art where there was a hybridization of techniques of image making. I wouldn't go into details because I really do not have the time. And this, in a way, this Dutch Bengal art, this invades Calcutta also. So even a new art idiom, new visual art idiom that emerges, and in Calcutta from studios, it starts getting printed for the mass market and in the form of oleographs. And this predates Ravi Verma's establishment of his press in Ghatkopar, which we know much more about. And even today, many of the kitschy religious prints that we have of popular religious art belongs to the Dutch Bengal school of art, which was later superseded by the Bengal school of Abanindranath and others. But anyway, I want to say that how Dutch Bengal is a school of art, and again, therefore, a polycolonial visual art. Similarly, in the domain of performative arts also, we all know that proscenium theatre in Bengal was not an English product, English invention, but rather a Russian the first player, a Russian adapted a French play and presented it in his theatre. So we all know of Gerasim Lebedev, and we all know that in 1795, we all know how proscenium theatre was built in Bengal by a Russian, and not really, it's not an English invention. And even as Shumanta Banerjee argues, and I agree with this argument, I mean, though some can disagree, and therefore I've deliberately given the reference so that no one comes after me. Shumanta Banerjee argues that even the popular subaltern forms like Kheur, Kobigan, etc., they all arose in French Chandanagar, because in French Chandanagar there was much greater caste class gender fluidity, and Calcutta got introduced to even subaltern popular performative cultural forms from French Chandanagar, rather than they being inventions, autochthonous inventions in British Calcutta. And a classic example would be Anthony Ferengi himself, a Luso-Indian from Chandanagar, from French Chandanagar, who, however, became such a big name in the subaltern popular performative sphere in Calcutta. To move on very fast to the third register, which is the polycolonial basis of urban culture and hybridity and diaspora. Again, as I've already said very briefly earlier, even urban cosmopolitanism was not an English invention, because the Bandel-Hooghly-Chhatgaon belt was already a city, a cosmopolitan multicultural city, much before Calcutta was founded. And even French Chandanagar and Danish Srirampur had many of the markers of urban public spheres, like the Strand along the river and hotels and taverns, much before Calcutta would have any of these. And even Calcutta, as I've argued, was not really founded by the British, as post-colonial common sense would have us believe, but rather it was just a filling in of gaps, because Betor was already settled in by the Portuguese by the 1560s. The Armenians were not a European colonial presence, but nevertheless, the Armenians were already there in Shutanuti in central Calcutta by the 1630s, and the Dutch had already settled a colony in Boranagar in North Calcutta by the 1650s, and the British kind of just filled in the gaps. And a similar polycolonial history can be also drawn about for Dhaka, the other urban center. Talking about diaspora, which is the second subpart of this third point of mine, similarly, even the introduction of Christianity, and that we all know in Bengal, because the British actually banned missionary activities in their territories till 1813. It is primarily a Portuguese and also an Armenian affair, but I'm not focusing much on Christianity here, which you can look up. But also in terms of diaspora, so Bengalis become diasporic to begin with through slave trade and through employment as laskars right from the 16th century. We have many Bengalis spread all over the mercantile world, all over the colonial world, and primarily through Portuguese Dutch enterprises. And of course, by 1614, we have something that Imtiaz Habib talks about, and others also mention, the well-known case of the first Bengali in England who gets renamed as Peter Pope and he first Bengali to land in England was in 1614. So it wasn't that England had no role to play in accommodating Lascars or accommodating Bengalis, but there were probably many more in the Portuguese, Dutch, French settlements in the form of indentured laborers, in the form of Lascars. And a very important case, which I very briefly discuss in my book, is that of Zamor. So Zamor was this character from Chittagong, and he played a major role in the French Revolution. So not only were there Bengalis in Europe by the 18th century, they were playing major roles in the French Revolution also. And again, it's a polycolonial basis of this hybridity of this diaspora. Moving on to the fourth register, which is educational institutions. Again, our common sense is that the English set up the first Western schools, the first Western colleges, the first Western universities, and one couldn't be more wrong, because the oldest English school was the Charity School, which was set up in 1729 or so, which gets renamed as Free School in 1789, and that is why the street is called Free School Street, as we all know. But the Portuguese set up in Bandel a school for children, and which survived as early as 1599, which is the College of St. Paul. And similarly, even when we talk of higher education, college, the first Western college in Bengal is not Hindu college, not Presidency College. 5 years before that, in Dutch Hugli Chinsura, already Hugli College was set up. So Hugli College was set up in 1812. And currently, the old building of Hugli College is called Hugli Collegiate School. And like Hindu College is also split into Hindu School and Presidency College similarly. And Hugli Mohsin College, which was established after the Dutch left in 1836, is the current, but that's not the point. The point is Hugli College was established in 1812, 5 years in Dutch Chinsura, 5 years before Presidency. And similarly, the oldest university also, while Calcutta University was established in 1857, 30 years, 3 decades before that, Srirampur College, which was originally established in 1818 as a college, Srirampur College, it formally became a university because on 23rd February 1827, the King of Denmark gave a charter. And even today, as you would know, Srirampur College has 2 parts. The secular departments are affiliated to University of Calcutta, while the theology department is a separate university, which is still governed. It is even now governed by this charter. But anyway, so in 1827, Srirampur College became a university, 30 years before University of Calcutta, and it is the oldest university in Asia. Moving on similarly fast to the 5th register, and where unfortunately I have to spend maybe a little more time than brushing it aside, but I'll spend just a couple of minutes more. I'm moving very fast in any case because one has to. Now, Bengal was a very late starter in print. Print started in Bengal only in the late 18th century. But in the rest of South Asia, print is a very old phenomenon and a polycolonial phenomenon. So again, it's not an English phenomenon at all. So the first press was in 1556 in Portuguese Goa, then in Danish Trankebar, etc. You can see it all. I won't read and waste your time. And throughout the Danish settlements, the Portuguese settlements, the Dutch settlements, the French settlements, the English also start playing a role because the oldest English press is also quite old, 1674. But anyway, throughout South Asia, print spreads through polycolonial networks right from the mid-16th century. And in Bengal, it was a very late starter. But when it did start, again, the first press in Bengal was in Hugli, was in Dutch Hugli Chinsura, and not in British Calcutta. And this is something that has to be noted. And even before that, the first books in Bengali, I had already mentioned Roman Catholic Shangbad. So the first books printed in Bengali were in the Roman script, unfortunately, and from Lisbon in 1743. And there were 3 books which was published simultaneously, Brahman Roman Catholic Shangbad, and also 2 more books by Manuel de Assumpção. And they were all published in the Roman script, but from Portugal. And not English were not interested in publishing anything in Bengali at all, even though by the mid-18th century, they were an entrenched presence in Bengal. But this was in the Roman script. So when did print start in the Bengali script? Again, Bengali script also, printing in Bengali, in the Bengali script also started by the Germans, the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, and not by the English. Again, Shukanta Chaudhuri says, and therefore again I've given the reference because I have a slight disagreement with this date, but that I have elaborated in my book, but here I wouldn't go into that. I just cite Shukanta Chaudhuri. According to Shukanta Chaudhuri, the earliest instance of Bengali characters being printed was in 1667 in a book published from Amsterdam, so Dutch. The first instance of Bengali printing was Dutch. And then Shukanta Chaudhary goes on to say that several Portuguese books also around the 17th century itself were published. 7, in fact, he enumerates 7, which were published, which all had Bengali letters. So again, the Dutch were doing that, the Portuguese were doing that. M. Siddiq Khan gives a little more elaborate and slightly divergent list, but the list is again of a similar order. That is, namely, it was the French. So in his opinion, in 1609, the first instance of Bengali letters being printed was in 1692 in a French enterprise. But he also says the French, the German, etc., they were publishing Bengali print and not the English. So the initiation of Bengal printing in Bengali script also started by the Germans, by the French. And even when Bengal got initiated into print culture, that is, press started getting set up in Bengal, the first attempt was by William Boltz, whom I mentioned earlier, the German Austrian colonizer. And in 1766, that is 10 years before actually presses will be set up in Bengal, he already made an attempt. And even the oldest newspaper was attempted to be brought out by William Boltz 12 years before Hickey's Gazette. But that's another issue. But nevertheless, a German effort. And similarly, the first 3 presses that were set up in 1777, one was straightforwardly Dutch, in Dutch, Hugli Chinsura. One was straightforwardly Swedish, because it was by the Swedish Johann Zacharias Kiernander. And one was ostensibly English, that is Hickey's Press. But Hickey's Press used typefaces, as the third bulleted point will go on to show. It used typefaces that were forged in the Hugli foundry. So it was apparently an English-run press, and its books were apparently published by Hickey, but the typefaces were still forged in Dutch Chinsura. And also Hickey entered into this controversy, a major altercation, major legal tussle with Kiernander, which has been very nicely documented, and I won't go into it. So there were polycolonial connections too. And anyway, I'll move on from this slide, because otherwise one will waste a lot of time. So the first presses in Bengal were all polycolonial. Let's stop at that, rather than being pure British products. But the more important revolution happened with the introduction of the Srirampur Mission Press in Danish Srirampur. I have already said that proselytization was fully banned in British territories, and therefore missionaries had to travel to other territories to do their missionary activities, including printing. And therefore printing started in a major way. And the first full-length book, which was Matthew Rochito Mongol Samachar, so this is Matthew Rochito Mission Samachar, which is the third bulleted point here, and also a translation of New Testament. So these all started through Christian treatises, but the Danish Srirampur Press, and often facing British opposition, the Danish Srirampur Press became the first prolific Bengali press, and publishing books by the lakhs, by hundreds of thousands, and also not just publishing Christian treatises, but also things like Hitopodesh and Mahabharat, and even the first monthly magazine, Digdarshan, the first Bengali newspaper, Samachar Darpon. These were all brought out not by any British press, but by the Danish Srirampur Press. And also school books, textbooks, and I've listed quite a few here. So the entire initiation was done by a polycolonial matrix, and predominantly by Danish Srirampur. To move on very fast to my penultimate, and I would just finish in, I'm seeing the time is just running out, and I'm clearly out of time, but I'll finish in just 2 more, I say 2, but 3 more minutes maybe. So to move on to my penultimate and my 6th register, that is the introduction of social and political reforms. Again, I quote Shumanta Banerjee, because there can be disputes about this. Shumanta Banerjee goes on to say that in French Chandannagar, slavery was abolished much before it was done in British Calcutta, and Sati was also stopped in French Chandannagar much before it happened in British Calcutta. So social reforms were brought about in French Chandannagar much earlier, but political reforms are main, because French Chandannagar had its own constitution, which I'll come to in my final point. After the French Revolution, Chandannagar had its own constitution, and by 1880s, the Bengali citizens, the native citizens of Chandannagar already had voting rights and a participative democratic government, and which was again much before it happened anywhere in British territories. And therefore, to move on almost connectedly to my last and final register, which is the rise of revolutionary and decolonizing consciousness. In fact, the history of French Chandannagar itself is a history of revolution, of decolonization. And when the French Revolution happened, Chandannagar also rose in revolution. And in 1789, they drove away the French governor, and Chandanagar were declared to be free. And the free revolutionary government actually ruled Chandanagar till 1793. And the British paradoxically captured Chandanagar and handed it back to the official French regime. But whatever it is, Chandanagar therefore already had this decolonizing atmosphere about it. And many revolutionaries in British India would also take refuge in Chandanagar, notable being, of course, Aurobindo, who first took refuge in Chandanagar and later fled to Pondicherry, also a French colony, but also homegrown revolutionaries in Chandanagar, like Kanailal Datto and Motilal Roy and Rashbihari Bose, who is, of course, the most famous amongst all these. They were all from Chandanagar. And the moot question here is, so Chandanagar had its own host of revolutionaries, but they were not raging a decolonizing revolution against the French government in Chandanagar. They were fighting the British regime, someone else's problem, from Chandanagar. So this is a very interesting thing, because they did not have much to fight about in Chandanagar. They were already kind of free citizens. But anyway, the polycolonial entanglements, and this is the 7th point, and wherein a second interesting case becomes that of the Greeks, because the Greeks themselves were colonized at that point of time by the Turkish, and Calcutta became a hotbed of Greek decolonizing activities, and which in turn also infused itself into the native decolonizing fervor. So even on the 7th register, the rise of revolutionary and decolonizing consciousness was also a polycolonial affair, rather than one induced by British ideas, British education, as post-colonial common sense often makes out to be. So my moot point, therefore, is that this could be a template. The fact that in Bengal, I only use the illustration of Bengal, but it can be extended to other territories of the South, other territories of the colonized world. And we can all study our intersected, entangled polycolonial histories through such a polycolonial template. And I believe that this history of polycoloniality in Bengal can possibly provide, I've already said that, I won't repeat. So this renegotiating of post-colonialist common sense, and this renegotiation becoming the site for somehow accommodating differences, becoming pluralistic, and having dialogues amongst our apparently diverse colonial experiences, but which are all entangled. This can make possible a South-South dialogue, a South-South solidarity. And this, therefore, this polycolonial facilitation of South-South solidarity can itself lead to those desired ends, where we can fight insular national monisms, we can fight contemporary new imperialisms, we can fight contemporary new fascisms, the problems that plague our world. So thank you very much. That's all that I wanted to say. And I thank you for your patience and time.
Thank you, Professor.
I don't know how to return. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, no. What is this? You can probably still see my screen, no?
I can see. Yes. You have to just stop presenting.
I have to. I don't know how to. Yeah. Now I am.
You stop presenting.
Okay. Yes. Stop presenting.
Yes.
I've stopped presenting.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Bhaduri, for that invigorating lecture, sort of a throwback for some of us to our classroom experience long time back. But thank you very much for that. And without, again, much delay, I would move on to our next speaker, Dr. Hepzibah Israel, Senior Lecturer in Translation Studies, University of Edinburgh. Her topic for today is Translation and Postcolonial Discourses of the Indian Nation. Dr. Israel.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you to the organizing committee for inviting me to give a talk as part of this South-South dialogue, a very important one, as we know, in the global context. I will enter this South-South dialogue from a slightly different angle to Shogoto's. First, that I did not take a risk of using PowerPoint. And second, I will focus quite firmly on the nation, but I'll also show connections with how we can enter the South-South dialogue through the lens of translation. So I see translation as a repeated act of writing to, writing across, or over and together, to steal a phrase from the concept note that was circulated by the conference organizers. My research focuses on translation, especially the translation of sacred texts in India and beyond. But more recently, I've become increasingly interested in translation history and the politics of constructing histories of translation. So how are these histories constructed and how are they used for what political purposes? What I hope to suggest is that engaging critically with translation history presents a way of, amongst many others, of challenging many of the binaries that we saw in the concept node. And it is also a way of challenging narrow constructions of national histories, while at the same time highlighting pluralities of postcolonial experiences in the South. What role does translation play in the construction of ideas of nationhood in contemporary India? And conversely, how does it serve to challenge dominant ideas of the Indian nation state in relation to its neighbors in the South? I should let you know that I am going to be reading most of this paper in order to keep to time, because I always talk extra when I'm presenting without a script. I wish to consider the place and function of translation in two different kinds of nation-building exercises from the post-independence context of the Indian nation state. The significant players in this history respond to and are keen to create the idea of India as a sovereign state. And they seek to define it as a nation in an attempt to address a seemingly overwhelming heterogeneity that is perceived as challenging the basis of a united, self-contained nation state. The kinds of interventions that translations and ideas about translation may make in the conceptualization of India as a nation are not commonly examined, but as I hope to show, can help us pose some constructive questions that might help us to engage with the South-South dialogue. In what follows, I focus on two reconstructions of history that serve as nation-building mechanisms. One in which literary history is constructed to build or even prove an always already present cultural unity underlying the political state, and the other a widespread controversy over a scholarly essay on translation and its implications for defining the culture and history of the Indian nation state. In both cases, certain interpretations of what translation may or may not be play a performative function to perpetuate or challenge ideas of the Indian state as a unified autonomous nation. I suggest that taking into account translation histories in the Indian context might be a useful means by which to unpack some of the complex ways in which meaning-making processes and discourses have been mobilized in the political life of post-independent India. And I suggest that it is important to address political discourses within nations and their relationships with their neighbors as part of a wider South-South dialogue. Given the rich history of translation practice, a comprehensive translation history for the Indian context does not yet exist. In fact, a comprehensive translation history of individual languages has not yet been written either. But would such a monumental task, if ever undertaken for each individual language, serve a purpose? Multilingualism and the complex social history of literary composition that this entails historically is celebrated as an asset on the one hand, but also paradoxically seen as a burden to the Indian nation state when viewed through the lens of linguistic nationalism. With no one national language and with two equally controversial official languages, this is a subject ripe for continued anxiety in attempts to construct a unity for the Indian nation state. National state-funded institutions, such as the Sahitya Academy, as we know, have played an important part in the construction of an Indian canon of literature by promoting writing in and translating across the modern Indian languages, including instituting a prestigious national annual reward for translation in 1989. While this was a progressive decision in that it recognizes the importance of translation, it is also clear that literary translation was conceived largely as a tool for the newly independent government of India in the 1950s to achieve one of its objectives, soon after political independence. So that it sets up the Academy with this resolution, part of its constitution, as a national organization to foster and coordinate literary activities in all the Indian languages and to promote through them all the cultural unity of the country. The Sahitya Academy organized 4 workshops focusing solely on literary translation between 1986 and 88 to bring together translators working in the different Indian languages to offer both theoretical grounding and an undertaking of the various issues and challenges that translators have to confront, especially in the multilingual Indian setting. Ayyappa Panikar's detailed report frames participating translators as activists engaged in the building up of our national literary consciousness. And he quotes the opening remarks of a fellow member of the organizing committee, quote, "Too often values have tended to become parochial and localized, leading to loss or at least overshadowing of that unity in diversity which has already characterized the Indian polity. This has given rise to the immediate need to look afresh at the very source of Indian unity and Indian sensibility. The multiplicity of language in our country has tended to erode unity and obscured the oneness of Indian sensibility and ethos. Translation, it would appear, is the only means of providing us a release from the narrow prison house of different languages and affording us a fresh view of oneness, unity, and commonality." Unquote. This is from 1991. This association between the many languages of India and translation is made in several other organizations and instances as well. For example, another state-funded publishing house, National Book Trust, also established in the 1950s, publishes a large number of translations both into English and other Indian vernaculars, including translated literature for children, putting into effect a popular slogan, "Unity in Diversity," repeatedly mobilized during public events, celebrating the nation at all events, from the local school to the national or international stage. Hence, literary translation is invested with the serious political function of promoting cultural affinity and thereby supposedly political unity by offering readers access across divisive linguistic barriers. While both institutions encourage translations directly from one Indian language to another, the specter of English remains in its function as bridge language, as is evident in Sahitya Academy's flagship journal, Indian Literature, where Indian language literatures are translated into and discussed in English, or in its commissioning and publication of the Encyclopedia of Indian Literature in 6 volumes and of S.K. Das's series of the History of Indian Literature in English. Other earlier publications, such as Mohanty's Bibliography of Indian Literature in English translation, are envisaged with a similar purpose of helping with this process of unification of consciousness. Quote, "Translations have broken the barrier between one Indian literature and another and have forcefully established the idea of oneness in Indian literatures, which could not be done by translations from Sanskrit in the past. Readers in one Indian literature have become increasingly aware of their neighbors, which they were not before, to an understanding of unity and compactness of Indian literature in spite of its many divisions." Unquote. Most comparative literary study is routinely undertaken in English, in which translations into English are taken for granted, as if this were a transparent, neutral part of the process that simply allows scholars direct access into a language literature they themselves cannot read firsthand in another part of the country. This obfuscation of the process of translation, however, is expedient for the nation-building literary project of literary study and literary history. Rather than this instrumentalist view of translation that facilitates an integration or unity of literatures written in Indian languages into the problematic and fluid category Indian literature, what if we were to deploy the study of translation as a deconstructive tool? I'm aware, as I ask this question, that the term translation is itself a contested category, with Indian scholars contending that translation in the Indian context does not fit standard definitions offered from within Western intellectual history. that is, as the successful transference of meaning intact and faithful from one single original text or language into another single target text or language. Alternative phrases such as transcreations for conveying the emotional heart of a text accurately, tellings, chaya or shadow, verbatim translations between Prakrit and Sanskrit have been suggested as closer to the observable phenomena in the relationship between Indian texts. However, my call for a greater attention to translation does not depend on positing one or posing one definition over the other as the most accurate, which would demand a separate study altogether. Rather, I suggest that investigating contesting interpretations of what translation has meant within the Indian historical context over several centuries of textual activity, as well as the identification and examination of translation practice and methods, can contribute to our understanding of how literary meaning and value has been constructed over time and for what purpose. Despite the considerable interest in promoting literary translation on the part of national institutions, there are large gaps in our knowledge of the part played by translation historically. How did languages and their literatures develop over centuries and influence or challenge each other across this vast subcontinent? And here I include India's political neighbors. Indications of overlap and continued movement of languages and peoples demand that we pay attention to the bases and processes of interactions and the politics that underpins these. That is, to translation, linguistic, cultural, and metaphorical, rather than to language literatures and traditions as discrete entities. How do these several strands of translation speak to the multilingual and multiliterary context charted above? Genealogies of translation can highlight dynamic circulation and movement rather than static snapshots or stagnation, points of contact and discontinuities rather than self-contained teleologies. It seems to me that paying attention to the context, politics, function, and effects of translation can clarify, augment, or challenge certain aspects of current narratives on national literature that may have previously remained obscure. Moreover, it allows us to speculate on new ways of seeing relationships between the multiple languages and literatures, and not merely in terms of an impediment to the unity of the Indian nation. And this in turn might allow us to reappraise what translation means in the South-South context. Much more work needs to be done to recover connections between political institutions, power, and translation, which, given the number of languages and cultures in cultural interactions involved, demand collaborative research projects that bring together scholarly expertise from various fields, from various languages and cultures across the global South. In the next half of my paper, I will focus on an essay on translation, 2 interpretations of the Ramayana in translation, and 3 thoughts on its uses, to comment on the extent to which interpretation of translation, elite and lay, have powerful political currency in defining India as a nation today. In 2005, the history department of the University of Delhi included for the first time an essay written by the literary scholar and translator A.K. Ramanujan's article, 300 Ramayanas, 5 examples and 3 thoughts on translation, in one of its undergraduate courses. Some of you or most of you may be familiar with this history, but I thought I would briefly go over it just to refresh our memories. The interdisciplinary history course, Culture in India, a Historical Perspective, designed to create a critical understanding of the diverse cultural heritage of ancient India, began to be taught in 2006. After approximately 2 years, in February 2008, members of the Akhil Bharatiya Vidyarthi Parishad, a youth wing of the Bharatiya Janata Party, and Shiksha Bachao Andolan Samiti violently attacked the head of the history department, Dr. Jaffrey, demanding that this essay be withdrawn from the course. Since 2008, this essay has been at the center of a controversy that has involved the university's teachers, students, academic council, vice chancellor, the Delhi High Court, the Supreme Court of India, and Oxford University Press, India. Fierce controversy has ensued with strong opinions from both supporters and detractors regarding what this essay argues about the Ramayana and its translation. As we know, the Ramayana is available in innumerable forms as written and performance texts in the many languages of South and Southeast Asia, continuing into the present. Valmiki's Sanskrit Ramayana has been considered chief among them in terms of chronology, sophistication, and significance. The epic in its many permutations has the potential to operate at several levels simultaneously, and either overtly or implicitly speaks to the literary, sacred, and political. The political nature of the Ramayana tradition is manifest in readings that take it to represent the ideal behavior of a king and his subjects located in a utopian state. And here I'm speaking beyond India to the Southeast Asian context. For instance, the translation history of the Ramayana in Thailand is fascinating because in the 18th century, the Thai kings not only supported and patronized the translation of the Ramayana into Thai, but were themselves translating sections of the Ramayana into the Thai language and presented themselves as the Rama, as a Buddhist Rama ruling over Thailand. So we can see these connections through translation of a set of texts across Southeast Asia. Paula Richmond's collection of essays showcases examples from the powerful questioning tradition historically embedded within the Ramayana corpus, as well as those that employ it to critically comment on political situations in India, but also in Fiji and in contemporary UK. So in the 1980s and 90s, to comment or to challenge fascist regimes or challenge sexism or racism in all these different contexts. I don't have time to go into that later, but if you're interested, I can comment on it later. How do these several strands of translation speak to the multilingual and, sorry, moving on. Yes. So A.K. Ramanujan, in his essay, offers a critical reading on what he terms the multiple tellings of the Ramayana and how they relate to each other. His central argument is that each telling of the Ramayana should not be thought of as a version, as the term immediately evokes or even conjures into existence an original, that is, a source from which all others are derived. He argues, therefore, that Valmiki's Sanskrit Ramayana is not to be considered an original from which all other versions obtain, but that this is merely one among many other tellings. Ramanujan does not deny that there is a relationship between these several hundred texts, forming in itself a genre with a variety of instances. It is just that this relationship, in his opinion, is not hierarchical in nature. Ramanujan is equally open to rejoicing in the similarity between any two versions where this occurs, as much as he cherishes and savors the differences between two renderings. And I'm particularly interested in his challenge to this hierarchical nature of translation. Now, most of you who have engaged in literary studies in Indian languages and translation studies will be aware that one of the primary arguments from Indian scholars on translation is that translation in the Indian context has never been hierarchical. So unlike the West, where, or like a homogeneous West, quote unquote, where the idea of translation always seems to present a hierarchical relationship between an original source text and its translation, most Indian scholars will argue that it is more transcreation with equal relationships between texts that are seen or perceived as original and those that are perceived as translations. However, although Ramanujan is making the same claim about the Ramayana, this very argument becomes extremely problematic for some sections of the Indian population. The essay is significant for several reasons. First, it focuses on a text that is considered key to Indian culture and history, holding literary, sacred, and by many civilizational value. And by focusing on its several renderings, the essay seeks to highlight the importance of paying attention to our understanding of translation as an integral part of this history. Second, the essay offers a theoretical perspective on translation in the Indian context and the relationship between texts and languages, as I've just said. By challenging a range of hierarchies assumed to be normative in the relationships between texts and languages, it also challenges the social and political hierarchies that have been interpreted in the light of the Ramayana as acceptable or indeed desirable. Third, it has initiated a rich body of scholarship on the Ramayana internationally that started paying attention to the way this narrative tradition traveled across several languages and sacred cultures from India into Southeast Asia. Last, by inadvertently starting a storm of controversy, it foregrounds the extent to which thoughts on translation, even a mere 3, can be deemed politically dangerous, to be commandeered and contained in defense of protecting the Indian nation state and its culture as conservative Hindu lobbies located both in India and outside seek to define it. What in this academic essay causes such offense to some sections of the Indian public? To those who see themselves as gatekeepers of a glorious and untainted Hindu past, it is Ramanujan's reading of how one may understand translation and how it has functioned in the Indian context, which is highly problematic. Crucially, it is Ramanujan's leveling argument that Valmiki Sanskrit Ramayana is just one of many tellings and so should be considered on a par with all other Indian and Southeast Asian tellings that is most controversial. He refers not just to the Rama story as told in other language traditions, but also in other religious traditions, because his essay also deals with the Buddhist and Jain tellings. By giving equal credit or value to all existing tellings of the Ramayana, Ramanujan's thesis prevents the classifications of uncomfortable versions of the story as deviant translations, with historical and moral truth resting firmly in one authoritative original. Denying the existence of an original challenges equally powerful and popular convictions within India regarding a historical King Rama who is believed to have had a physical birth at a particular location in the city of Ayodhya in real time and space. With their focus on other characters, these other versions of the Ramayana, which Ramanujan discusses in his essay, there is the possibility that his wife, for instance, they focus on other characters, the possibility that his wife Sita may have been successfully seduced by the villainous Ravana, and with the more sympathetic renderings of Ravana, amongst a plethora of other differences, the thesis of the coexistence of several hundred Ramayanas challenges the Sanskrit Valmiki epic's place in the popular Hindu imagination as the sole authentic narrative. The other tellings become acceptable as long as and only if they can be labeled as translations in the hierarchical sense, which can then be interpreted as having regrettably corrupted a pristine original in the process of translation. Placing Valmiki's Ramayana on the same playing field as all the other language versions, Ramanujan's essay comes dangerously close to challenging the political function of the Rama story. The primary and symbolic power of the story in the political imagination over centuries, as Sheldon Pollock argues, has lain in, quote, the text offering two linked instruments, whereby on the one hand, a divine political order can be conceptualized, narrated, and historically grounded, and on the other, a fully demonized other can be categorized, counterposed, and condemned, unquote. Ramanujan's argument, giving equal weight to contesting versions of the story, challenges such symbolic uses of the story for the symbolic reordering of human and cosmic worlds. Of course, the controversy over the prescription of Ramanujan's essay for study is only one among a range of disputes over meaning and who has the right to make meaning of the epic in recent times. Particularly pertinent is the political controversy over Ram Janmabhoomi that since 1992 has continued to fester. And as we know, continues till today, with our Prime Minister laying the foundation for the building of the new temple. As we know, the controversy has dragged on for so long that it is no longer relevant whether there was indeed a temple structure pre-existing the mosque on the site. What is of greater relevance is the persistent belief in the temple as the first, therefore original site of true worship, with the mosque featuring as a later deviant copy. And here you can see the parallel to the argument about the Ramayana that Ramanujan makes. So the moment you think of it as a translation, a hierarchical relationship of translation, then it's possible to speak of the temple as original and the mosque as parallelly as a deviant copy. And therefore, it is justifiable that it can be destroyed to point back to the original site. The important attribute of the importance attributed to Valmiki's epic as the sole authoritative text and therefore as the only authentic account of Rama is indispensable to proponents of the view that India is originally and primarily a Hindu state with all other identifiable religious traditions featuring as either benign offshoots or cancerous foreign adversaries that must be squashed. Only the Valmiki Rama, as the undisputed, untainted, and righteous protagonist of this national epic, can function as the rallying force of waves of popular anti-Muslim and later anti-Christian sentiment that could be distilled into direct political action from the 1990s onwards. And we all know what the repercussions of that is in present-day India. All other contesting language versions in this schema can be tolerated only as long as they can be written off as translations and therefore dismissed as counterfeit and misleading copies. Further, Ramanujan's essay also undermines the linguistic hierarchy between Sanskrit as the privileged language of the few and the rest of the Indian languages available to the masses. So long as the Sanskrit Ramayana is treated as the foundational text to which all other extant versions can be genealogically traced, the preeminence of the Sanskrit language, also associated in both elite and popular discourses as the foundational language of Hinduism, can be maintained. Attributing equal literary status to other language Ramayanas comes close to challenging the unique sacred and literary potency assigned to Sanskrit. While the detractors of Ramanujan's essay argue for the unity of the Indian nation state through this hierarchical modeling of translation, Ramanujan's equalizing model seems to lead to dangerous plurality and splintering of the Indian nation state from their point of view. So the tension between Ramanujan's argument as a literary critic and translator and the exigencies of an increasingly polarized political discourse in India is evident in the demand that his essay be proscribed from a leading university syllabus. Ramanujan's essay is still off the Delhi University history menu. According to newspaper reports, Oxford University Press India withdrew copies of the book which contained Ramanujan's essay. I have been unable to ascertain whether they have now resumed publication of this volume of essays and whether it is available for sale. This censorship is ironic since Ramanujan's essay is actually a celebration of the availability of the Ramayana tradition in its many forms and shows his deep appreciation of the long and established tradition of composing challenging versions of the Ramayana. which is why I found this such an irony that an essay that celebrates the Ramayana is actually seen as an anti-national academic statement. In the kind of 10 minutes, possibly that maybe 5 minutes that remain, I'd like to take you to an alternative set of counter-narratives of translation practice as a concluding statement. I've shown only very briefly how a study of translation projects can significantly illuminate the political and cultural life of an India imagined as a nation from specific perspectives. This is only the very tip of the metaphorical iceberg, of course, but indicates to what extent a critical engagement with histories of translation can contribute to our understanding of how meanings are constructed and serve to generate or sustain certain political narratives as the truth. At the same time, it is important to reiterate that I'm not presenting a single translation history as an alternative, as a positivist recovery of an objective truth about India's political past, or indeed of its present, but that this is one possible attempt to chart historical events and to highlight specific aspects of meaning making and efforts to construct India's identity as a unified nation. A focus on translation allows us to analyze how, when, and why significance was attributed to some texts were traditionally chosen for translation or inclusion in the canon in the first place. Usually, texts that are translated were written by upper caste heterosexual male writers, and those works which are given second or no place for translation are literatures written by women, by queer writers, by Dalits, or oral literatures by tribal communities. Such a literary map, when placed along the grid of the political nationalist map of India, reveal the fault lines along which some literatures and people are simply rendered invisible when charting out the boundaries of what is acceptable as Indian. However, it is important to remember that translation history can also serve teleological purposes to either bolster or challenge national meta-narratives. The work of several translators in contemporary India and their choice of text and themes to translate presents a counter-narrative to that of a majoritarian Hindu nation or its discourse. The translation of resistant literatures into English has promoted interest in issues that might otherwise have been dismissed as marginal to the nation state. These literatures, focusing on issues of acute inequality and discrimination faced by individuals and communities, challenged the grand narrative of India shining that became a part of mainstream nationalist political rhetoric almost contemporaneously. Translators of women's literature, feminist translators, translators of Dalit or tribal literatures all challenge the monochrome coloring of India in saffron that seeks to organize all aspects of Indian culture and society according to a singular interpretation of Hinduism. From amongst these, by way of a contrasting example to my discussion of Ramanujan's essay and its reception, I select the translation of partition literature as a resistant act and space that continues to disallow the representation of Muslims in the subcontinent as a Hindu India's demonic other. As we know, partition literature highlights the inhuman acts of violence, looting, and rape that was perpetuated in equal degree by three religious groups on each other: the Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. It focuses on the individual's emotional trauma caught in a post-independence triumphalist nationalism on either side of the borders, but explores a range of responses from lament to what was lost, to horror at what was witnessed, or bitter anger at the absurdity and needless suffering. Despite the intensity of this shared theme, it is important to point out that partition literature is written in at least 6 different languages: Bangla, English, Hindi, Punjabi, Sindhi, and Urdu, and by writers located in each of these 3 countries, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Partition literatures from all these languages are translated mainly into English to make them available to readers located across these 3 countries in the subcontinent. Juxtaposing short stories, poems, and essays from across national boundaries and placing them cheek by jowl within one volume is an act of resistance that challenges jingoistic nationalism. Editors, translators, and publishers have in each case highlighted the cultural overlap despite religious or linguistic differences, the sameness of the underlying human condition and response despite belonging to different sides of political boundaries. Amongst the best known of such works, just as a reminder, are Alok Bhalla's stories about the partition of India, Urvashi Bhutalia's The Other Side of Silence, Tarun Sen's Translating Partition, Debjani Sengupta's Map Making, and Rita Kothari's Unbordered Memories. Translating works from both sides of the borders also draw attention to the shared histories of language use, of Urdu, Sindhi, and Punjabi between India and Pakistan, and Bangla between India and Bangladesh. Assigning specific languages as primary to specific geographical spaces, for example, Urdu for Pakistan, Hindi for India, or Sanskrit for India, for instance, has been an important but unattainable aim of the political and cultural lives of these countries since 1947. Given these circumstances, it would have been very easy to translate literature on partition from any one of these three countries and to publish them as exclusively Indian stories on partition or Pakistani stories on partition, Bangladeshi stories on partitions. But most of the translators, as well as the editors, have refused to do so. So by refusing to translate and publish partition literature as discrete examples of literatures from specific nations, and by collaborating across borders with writers and translators across borders, these translators in their practice are intervening in narrow constructions of literary and cultural histories of India. And I suggest discrete histories of India in the South. The translation and publication of partition literature from several of these languages and from across the three countries in one anthology is one form of resisting or one form of resistance to the celebration of discrete South-South national boundaries. So they evoke a different set of historical memories and shared pasts that circumvent ideas of what is Indian and what is not. Partition literature of this kind, when translated across languages and country borders, is just one example of translation projects that both contest the classification of literary history in strictly nationalistic terms and challenges the demonization of the Muslim as the Indian nation's other on both sides of its borders. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Israel, for that extremely informative, and not just informative. It's a lecture that takes us into the complications of the entire project of translation. But from there, we move
Indini,
on.
We can't see you. Is it possible to see you?
Okay, sorry. Okay, we move on to Dr. Ipshita Chandu, Professor of Comparative Literature, FLU, Hyderabad. Her topic today is interrogating the categories South-South and postcoloniality in our praxis and pedagogy. Professor Chandra.
Thank you. Now, I actually have a paper and a PowerPoint, and the previous speakers have spoken about practically everything in both of these. So what... first and foremost, of course, that was one of the reasons I'm here, because apart from, meeting friends and making friends in a situation which we mistakenly call social distancing, I would like to speak at length about, mistaken nomenclature and strange categories. The reason why I'm calling it mistaken nomenclature and strange categories is that I was asked to speak as a comparatist. And the discipline in which I'm located teaches me to question the general category as the basis of understanding human beings. Literature's task is to understand oneself. But the crisis beyond the age of modernism is to understand the other. And I think that remains the most important focus of humanities scholarship. So that is something that I would like to bring to the table. Is it possible for us to understand our situation in the world today across the globe using these categories? The realization that the other is a person just like me, a human being, though she looks and speaks and eats differently, this realization having come to us through the identity-claiming movements and ideologies of the 70s in Europe, are now institutionalized within academia. The idea of a homogeneous post or a homogeneous West or a homogeneous Orient or woman or any other identity or subjectivity or category is, I submit, inadequate to understand the human being. Dr. Bhaduri has spoken at length of plurality, and what Dr. Israel said pulled plurality to language. So I have one multicolored slide, which at some point I would like to show you regarding both plurality and the plurality of language that we use. I'm not talking about polycolonizers, but I'm talking about the plurilingual situation in which we are located, which we prefer to call the post-colony. So, as I said, the idea of a homogeneous post or West or any kind of general idea seems to be inadequate to understand the human being. Postmodernism made and tried to substantiate that claim, and hence the structuralists were taken to task by the postmodern philosophers. I'm reminded of something that Lacan says in Freud's papers. He says that there is a pact in society which links subjects together in one action. And he defines that pact by saying the human action par excellence is originally founded on the existence of the world of the symbol, namely on laws and contracts. It is my proposal at this moment to abandon the contract of both South-South and post-colonialities and question the law by which I am bound to assume someone else's South as my own, when exactly the opposite is true. I am unable to understand which South we mean by South, because as Dr. Maniratne pointed out, the political South exists within the global capitalist North. So what is it South in relation to? This, in addition to the ideological coinage, the ideological history of the coinage, that is South-South, which has been trenchantly critiqued in the concept note for this meeting. I would just add the undeniable essentialism inherent in both Souths, South and South, reducing the shared realities of the so-called quote-unquote post-colonial world into a symbolic geography alone. I propose simply to think that we can step out of this cycle. And I'm only saying think. And the speakers before me have started this thinking. I would like to take it further and say that instead of renegotiating these existing categories, let us think of categories that more suit our actual condition. Again, as the previous speakers have begun to do. I simply propose to think that we can step out of this cycle and look around at our so-called post-colonial reality. There are various layers of embracing or delinking from the colonizer. Relationships stretching from the idea of the Commonwealth to the plural cultures across South Asia, to which Dr. Israel also referred. Besides, I do not think that we are past colonization yet. So it is somewhat disingenuous to say post-colonial. The control of one nation state upon the other, to the extent of remotely decimating its population with airborne or digital destruction, is still a power game for controlling resources and profiting from them, even when you have no sovereignty over them. They operate beyond your own boundaries. And then there is the matter of the New World Order, in which a permanent enemy seems to have been designated. So post-colonialities, even in the plural, seems deeply dislocated and fraught. I grew up in theory during the time that the third world as a category was based in development indices as a category for literary studies. And it was being replaced by, well, post-colonialism, a set of theories that moved away from development indices and tried to define the situation effectively by describing subjectivity. Now, I mean the relation to the world by subjectivity. But for the post-colonial theorist, subjectivity was considered some solid thing constructed of one or many identities, carrying with it a definable, categorizable mental state. This spawned identity politics. So we tried to decide who was more colored, who was less colored, who was able to call herself a woman, who could not fall within the category of woman that the feminists addressed because of class, and identity politics, which insisted that identity is homogeneous, or even if the identity is fractured and discontinuous, it must be single and privilege a single position. This problem may be addressed by a conceptual framework of pluralism, without reduction to the opposing terms, without reducing to a binary, without swinging to either materialism or indeterminateness, with only a way of understanding experience, that is, of being in relation to the world. I'm not proposing anything further than we think beyond these categories. From the materialist point of view, the point of convergence of the set of theories known as post-colonial is that they assume that those once colonized nations that gained independence from the colonizer or more than one colonizer were necessarily post-colonized. The idea of modernity, that is the assimilation into and of the colonizer's culture and language, was questioned by those who found themselves forced to locate their different-looking selves in the midst of those who were physically their radical opposites but spoke the same language. Most post-colonial theorists in the early days found themselves located in the colonizers' academic structures and wanted to make themselves relevant there. So post-colonial theorists of literature began to construct themselves into the critical discourse with narratives based on subjectivity in the West, trying to theorize a delimited universe of post-colonial text. I submit that when we isolate and fragment literatures written in, for example, Indian languages, which includes almost all the languages spoken in South Asian countries besides India, if we study them from the perspective of identity or subjectivity, as Dr. Israel has also pointed out, because their histories and their natures are such that they are plural in construction and orientation with comprehensibility across languages due to the plural nature of the sources, whether it is vocabulary, grammatical rules, etymology, which come from more than a single tradition represented by a single language culture. This plurality is not reflected in the research agenda of postcoloniality. Transforming the noun postcolonial into a plural, postcolonials or postcolonialities, is one of the least of the signals of this realization. What then should we do if we are to reject the premise on which our categories of thought are based, as I'm suggesting? Is it only an exercise of proposing one thing in place of another? I'm suggesting that we begin to think of a conceptual category that is based on plurality. If we are involved in the enjoyment of literature, then what I'm trying to propose has no relevance. I can still enjoy War and Peace without going into the questions of fiction and history and the work of the writer that Tolstoy, the writer himself, felt obliged to write in the afterword and the preface. But if I'm a student of literature, if pedagogy concerns me, then the first thing I wish to propose as an answer to the question why these premises have to be, well, not discarded, but rethought, but some categories of understanding are required anyway, is that categories related and rooted to the reality within which we perform the actual work of reading help us to see our geographical and intellectual location, our temporality and culture, and lastly, since we are talking about disciplinary practices, a particular pedagogy. What are we communicating on behalf of our discipline about the world? And how do we want it to be applied to the world when the student leaves us for the world? Keeping in mind the ethical position of the reader of literatures written in Indian languages is to turn to the language culture tradition where the individual text is located. It will be immediately clear that the literary tradition is not in a single register of the language. A very vibrant example of this is what we call Hindi, what should be called Hindustani, which covers the range of literary languages, and I emphasize literary. It covers the range of literary languages from Avdi to the borderline of Urdu. A similar phenomenon is visible in Bengali, and it has already been remarked upon. The language of Kolkata, the language of the Sundarbans, of North Bengal, of the Duars, of Birbhum, Mednipur, Purulia, bordering on the tribal areas of Jharkhand, are all called Bengali, but they are not the same language. How exactly do we apply any theory other than acknowledging the simple ontological plurality in our understanding of the human being as a fundamental category? If categories are necessary, let difference then become the defining idea in our understanding of humans. And what is the nature of the encounter with difference, the basis of the ethics that our disciplines in the humanities impart? In short, the premises on which to base our reading and scholarship of the humanities, with literature as a focus, require a reorientation of the terms of the discussion, instead of trying to mold our practices in accordance with received categories manufactured for us from a location that is not ours. There are far more experienced scholars of postcoloniality, and a couple have already spoken before me, singular and plural, among my colleagues. I will only point out that the post-colonial theory raised a question to liberal humanism, which is the political philosophy that encompassed the civilized world of democracy after the French Revolution, and which we inherited through mental colonization, I would say. In its insistence on the individual's autonomy and liberty, this political philosophy of liberal or neoliberal humanism also fostered the capitalist economy, stretching from the Industrial Revolution to globalization. The postmodern in philosophy lent these insights to the humanities scholars. Firstly, it introduced us to the assumption that there is no common denominator, no grand meta-narrative. In nature or truth or God or the future, nothing, no grand narrative guarantees either the oneness of the world or the possibility of neutral or objective thought. Secondly, we were introduced to the assumption that all human systems operate like language, being self-reflexive rather than referential systems. So there being multiple theories of truth, does that make truth itself an untenable concept? A binary worldview divides and stratifies the world. Pluralism as a philosophy or as a way of relating to the world dispenses with the hierarchy of truths, which Dr. Israel also mentioned, even after acknowledging multiple and not simply two truths or values. It argues for the plurality of worldviews and beings, and thereby raises the question not of identity, but of humanity. What rights does the human being have, even if she is different from me? All her aspects of life, are all her aspects of life accounted for in this spectrum of rights? Because the humanities are related to the life of humans and their being in and making of the worlds that they inhabit, the structure of feeling that academics from the once colonized world found in the academies of the erstwhile colonizers, and their articulation of that with their lives, public and personal, forms the bedrock of postcolonial theory, with its ideological commitment to the assertion of identity and claiming of rights for that identity. The identity turned out to be fractured, constituted in the context of hybridity, and therefore responding to that context. Now, to start with, what is a pure identity? By what logic and right do we call any identity pure, and thereby attach a value to the impure identity or the hybrid identity at once? Are we not buying into the idea of a seamless, abstract, essential subjectivity when we start this discourse of impure or hybrid subjects? But is not the critique mounted by postmodernism on liberal humanism and espoused by some varieties of postcolonial theory that there is no seamless whole subject, that the subjectivity is a relative position to the world and therefore temporally located? Philosophically then, postcolonial theory seems to be crafting its critique of the master's house with the master's tools. So what is the relation between the category of South-South and post-coloniality? When we say South-South, we understand perhaps a human being based on absolute geographical location. Again, was not one of the strands of postmodern philosophy that pushed back against the unified univocal subject and agency also instrumental in enabling us to see difference, whether it is through a critical stance on the humanities conception of the human being? Paradoxically, when the French went to colonize Africa, the Abbé Grégoire had to announce to the world that the Africans he had taken the mission of Christ to were humans just like us. As much as Goethe's celebrated comment on world literature involving the Chinese says that the Chinese reading habits tend towards the trivial, just like ours. Now, locating this plural ours in the space of some other identity or some other geographical area forces us to confront difference. Not repetition, but as another entity, another way of being in the world, different from ours. Literature brings that singularity to view. But as I have earlier pointed out, we need to ask how we encounter it. Perhaps it is hermeneutics, understanding, and not epistemology, knowing, that will render us a service here. For in the practice of epistemology, we must finalize and fix spatiotemporal categories must be defined in order to come under the rubric of justified true belief, that is fact. The crucial point is how we engage with difference. In the category of South-South, we do see an acknowledgement of difference as repetition. Perhaps the repetition is meant to be questioned because the usual formulation is juxtaposition of opposites, that is North-South. So the fraught history of the global South or the South-South formulation need not really lead us to redefine the category, since like nation, like liberal humanism, and like post-colonialism, we may wonder if these categories can be replaced with something that arises and speaks to our immediate experience. For after all, disciplines in the humanities are tasked with precisely that. So, while accepting the critique of the South-South formulation, I would ask whether it is possible to reflect upon an ethics of encountering difference, built upon mutuality, that may underlie our pedagogy and praxis. Does South-South indicate to us the equality of difference, which is a basic tenet of pluralism? The equality of difference, not a hierarchy between differences, which we have so far used to map the intellectual terrain from which we approach our lives as humans in the disciplines of the humanities. Is it possible for us to define plurality as the singular characteristic of India as a nation? Can we redefine nation in terms of plurality and not in terms of geographical location or racial or national or any other identity? Would it be possible to de-link post-coloniality from both subjectivity and identity and look at it relationally? That very move of admitting the other and perceiving ourselves in a relation to the other would assume plurality. Otherwise, there is nothing to have a relation with. Colonization of the mind, contingent upon the building of first slave economies and then colonial economies, extended to cultural imperialism. These ideals were exported and imposed on plural societies like India's or Nigeria's. These societies were composed of different linguistic cultural nationalities whose binding thread was again opposition to an alien power, in this case, the colonizers. The survival past the colonial menace of this plural unity could not be as uniform, homogeneous, single language, single culture, monolingual, monocultural nations. Thus, there were two possibilities. One, that the cultural diversity be grafted into the idea and ideology of the nation, which, in the context of diversity, needs to be an equality and not a hierarchy of differences. In other words, plural. The alternative to a plural conceptualization of nation is one which we are now gradually getting familiar with, that is majoritarianism. Identity politics arises from the hierarchy of difference and the politicization of that hierarchy. The philosophy and politics of pluralism questions the liberal humanist political philosophy of equality before law, personal liberty, and the rule of law. Because the first two, that is equality before law and personal liberty, are impossible in a society that is stratified, that is hierarchized by difference along the axis of caste, class, race, gender, religion. The homogeneity of the subject and its counter-discourse of hybridity are both inadequate to grasp this situation. And there can be no profit in continuing to attempt the understanding of it through the existing categories which came into being to understand manifestly different and other circumstances. Pluralism has not been conceived yet as a possible category of understanding, simply because we are still trapped in this unreal situation, donated to us by Western academia of the post rather than the new forms of colonization. Colonization of resources, labor, ethos, minds, even more so thanks to the digitization of existence across the globe and the rise of a new class, the digitally deprived. Capital has adapted itself to circumstances and social reorganization has followed this articulation. So, global capital has given rise to a virtually linked society in which access to digital resources, dependence on large-scale infrastructure, highly, if virtually, monetized. By linking roti, kapra, and makan to an Android phone, we are far from post or past the colonial. In fact, we are more deeply enmeshed in subtler varieties of colonization through the bonds of a power language, a power technology that far exceeds our resources. We are still at the so-called periphery, and I'm not certain how we can honestly or meaningfully work with the category of post-colonial or with the idea of nation inherited from the colonizers. What can it tell us about our experience in the world, about our praxis that should be clarified through what we teach, that is, our pedagogy? It is because of this that I suggest that we explore the idea of what Lakshman Khubchandani calls an organic sociolinguistic plurality, which came into being through many varieties of cultural contact, including the violent one of colonization. Pluralism would also entail questioning majoritarianism through the instrument of legalizing discrimination, as the apartheid state had done in South Africa. Could we end up in the assertion of the identity of the majority as the normal for the state unless we reimagine our categories of analysis, unless we look for categories neither geographical nor spatiotemporal nor historic, but affective and existential. Assuming that the goal of the humanities, education, is to shape the understanding of one's being in the world, and assuming that literature is an event of subjects connecting through the medium of language, I would insist on the location of the reader and the text, and a commitment to understanding that situation, so that I am in an encounter with another's world, with difference. I would ask, how do I understand my own reality through what I am engaged in my academic practices? Does my education not shape my understanding? And if it does not, what is its goal? Now, if I have some time, I would like to show you that one particular slide, which yeah. Is this visible? No. Okay,
No.
something else is visible. Something else is visible, right. Do I have time to do this? I can just leave it out.
No, you have time. You have time. Please do it.
Except that I don't seem to be able to do it.
You just need to go to the bottom of the page and just say present now. That will just sort of
go where and say present now?
Bottom right, it would be.
Bottom right, yeah, that's right. Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
present
Okay.
now.
Just
Yeah, and it's asking me for several possibilities. Your entire screen.
Share entire screen.
Okay, entire screen.
And then share.
That doesn't seem to be working either. Okay, entire screen.
And then share. Press share.
But share what?
Then your entire screen, we can see. Yeah, you're presenting. Now share your screen. Yes, we can see the language.
You can see? Right.
Yeah.
Now can you see? Now I'd like you to look at this, because this is a translation of a Bengali text into English. And I was thinking of this right through while Dr. Israel was speaking. And well, this is a translation published by Sahitya Academy. So it's not as if, we're not actually aware of the problems. But the reason why I have color coded it is because this is what I was talking about as the plurality of language, that this text has at least 3 different languages, visibly 3 different languages. That is, it's written in Bengali, so that's one. It's a particular register of Bengali. If you want to call that 2, that will make it 2. The language of the area in which the text is located, that is Hindi, which you see in green. English, which is, some words have been taken over by the people who inhabit this text. Incidentally, the people who inhabit this text are quote unquote untouchables, who live on the banks of the Son River in Purnia district of Bihar. And you can see the title. What does the title remind you of? I mean, I would like somebody to, this is something which I think needs to be
Ramcharitmanas.
Absolutely. The title reminds you of Ramcharitmanas. So all of this taken together is what I meant when I said the plurality of language. And the reason why I had the languages, the language families and the language spread, I mean, immediately if you look at Kashmir, you can see that in the language family map, Kashmir has more than one color. Whereas in the state map, it is a single state. So despite the fact that there is a linguistic division of states, we do know that a single state boundary does not automatically shift us to a single state language. So given this situation in which we really don't have those categories with their hard boundaries that linguists think and talk about, I think right from the start, what we require is a reconceptualization of categories in which the ideas of postcoloniality and the theories of postcoloniality, either we have outgrown them or they have become inadequate for us. And the history of the idea of the categorization of South-South, if we are able to re-inflect with plurality and difference, then I think that the dialogue that we can set up amongst ourselves, amongst the two continents that you have brought together and 3 different nation states, all plural, would be truly a lasting conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Chandu. That really, brings us to a conclusion for today's session, a conclusion which itself opens us up towards other possibilities and discussions around the area. So the 3 lectures that we had today, as we expected, they basically take up 3 registers, that all can ultimately link up to what we are trying to discuss, the question of plurality. So Professor Bhaduri, talked about the polymorphous interactions, polymorphous colonial polymorphous interactions, so to say. Dr. Israel talked about dialogue through translation. Translation also, excuse me, I'm just getting out of the frame. Translation as a mode of bypassing signposts. She also talked about the problems of translation, translation, the hierarchical dynamics involved within the process of translation. And finally, we come to Professor Chandu, who, this is subversion, or, some of us who have had the privilege of attending Professor Bhaduri's classes, he had a favorite phrase, tinkering from within. So Professor Chandu tinkered from within and actually problematized the very categories with which we sort of began our discussion, and then the categories around which we tried to frame this webinar. And she questioned those very categories, and she talked about categories of effective categories and existential categories, instead of categories based on merely political categories or merely identitarian categories. So there are some questions. Some questions were asked to Professor Bhaduri, and some of them he has already answered, I can see. So I sort of had my own set of questions. To ask, just to illuminate all the speakers one after another. So Professor Bhaduri, I would like to ask you, sir, the template of polycoloniality proposed by you, it basically relies on multiple nationalities of colonial powers. So how would you relate it to the emergence of the empire as a juridical order, what Antonio Negri calls empire as a world order? Do you think that there was a fundamental shift in this kind of polycolonial interactions, as we usher in a post-industrial revolution phase, what Eric Hobsbawm calls the age of empire? Do you think there was a fundamental change in terms of this kind of polycolonial interactions?
Yes, I mean, there was definitely a change from, let's say, the birth of the nation as in Europe. That is, I'm talking only about Europe here. The birth of the nation as maybe contesting linguistically defined insular governmental units, to the possibility of collaborative imperialism, which culminates in contemporary multinational, collaborative, globalized new imperialism, does see a shift. But my argument is that if we focus too much on the shift, we may end up theorizing colonialism as being a mononational enterprise. And in the process, we would lack the required critical apparatus and critical vocabulary to address multinational imperialism and fail in our current critical project. So I would like to focus, I mean, though, let's say, commonsensical, official historiography of the colonial period and also of post-colonialism would suggest definitely the mononational nature of erstwhile imperialism and the multinational nature of contemporary imperialism, and therefore focus on the break between the two. I would go on to suggest that erstwhile imperialism was also multinational. And that has been the thrust, and therefore to kind of underplay the so-called break and focus instead on the plurality, and which has several beneficial fallouts, which I have argued, not only in terms of being able to critically deal with multinational capitalism better, because our vocabulary would allow us to understand imperialism multinationally, but also be able to counter a certain trend which maybe Hart and Negri did not foresee that well, which is emergent fascism, so that plurality itself allows for a polemical possibility of dealing with multiplicities much more fruitfully. So I acknowledge the break, but I would rather underplay the break and argue for erstwhile imperialism to have also been multinational.
Right, right. So I would also, and this is sort of more of a personal inquiry. What I found interesting, because I also read your the book. What I also found interesting is the fact that you kind of question the categories of urbanity, of diaspora. I mean, this entire the Bengali diaspora as sort of a privileged entity, as sort of a voluntary diaspora as a voluntary movement of privileged classes. And there are several recent books, you'll be reminded of Sudip Chakraborty's The Bengalis, where he keeps talking about these categories, but you basically associate it with the history of slave trade, indentured labor, etc., and also urbanity, because all of us, this Oud moment of the foundational moment of Calcutta, and we were all fed the narrative of one heroic job churn of just entering and settling down in Shutanoti, and here comes Calcutta. But you kind of it's a palimpsest. So urbanity itself is a palimpsest that you talk about, which is I find very interesting. I would ask you to elaborate a little bit on the dissemination of the techniques of image printing. It's as you said, it's a polycolonial technique, but undertaken by Bengali workers. You have mentioned Panchanan Karmakar, sort of the the famed Panchanan Karmakar. He's credited with the first Bengali font in wooden block. So a polycolonial technique undertaken by Bengali workers, and then the gradually Bengali comprador class setting up the printing presses, not just Bortola but in other areas also. So how was this working? How was this dissemination of print culture taking place? If you could just elaborate a little bit on that.
I think you've raised three very unrelated points. The first is, of course, about how Bengali diaspora is not a very recent phenomenon where, let's say, tech graduates have emigrated to the US or something like that, but it's a 5-century-old phenomenon, primarily through slaves, indentured laborers, and lashkars, majorly lashkars. Lashkars are the primary mainstay of Bengali diaspora in Europe. So that was one point, and which in a way connects to your third point, because the focus therefore shifts on the laboring Bengali rather than the privileged Bengali. And also the comprador and the laboring Bengali are kind of two sides of the same coin, which would feed into the polycolonial cog. The second question was about the city, and which is just factual. It is of course counterintuitive, which is contrary to the common sense, but which is factually absolutely correct, that Shadgaon Hooghly Bandel leading right up to through Chandannagar to Srirampur, that was that preceded as an urban template Calcutta, and Calcutta in itself was also filling in of gaps of colonies and establishments already by the Portuguese, Dutch, etc. That's just factual. I really don't have much to comment, but that our Calcutta-centric notion of Bengali cultural output has to probably also been displaced to other centers. Apart from that, the third point is something that one needs to look at far more deeply. So evidently colonialism, whether of the polycolonial sort or the monocolonial sort, could not have worked itself without sufficient collusive cooperation and sufficient collusive collaboration with the Bengalis or by the Bengalis themselves. And so in all these colonies there was, but the caste structure often varies. So again, something that Shumanta Banerjee points out very clearly, that maybe the caste structure of the primary collaborators in Chandannagar were very different from the caste structures of the primary collaborators in Calcutta. So the caste structures would differ, but however, the collaborative aspect of Bengali labor as well as Bengali capital and Bengali entrepreneurship in promoting trade and the circulation of print capital, that definitely needs to be looked into. And lest I have been misunderstood that it was somehow the colonizers, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Danish, who were the sole agents of the entire print revolution, lest I have been misunderstood regarding that. Evidently we have to also bring into foreground, and Panchanan Karmakar I mentioned incidentally, though I did not name him in my oral thing, but it was there in the slide. But we do need to, I fully concede your point that lest one is misunderstood, one needs to also foreground the labor and the entrepreneurship of the Bengali collaborators too in these polycolonial enterprises. Of course, also suitably stratifying and classifying these Bengalis across the different colonies, because maybe the religious and caste identity of all the Bengali collaborators was not the same across the different colonies by the different European powers.
Thank you, Professor Bhaduri. Then I move to Dr. Israel, and there are quite a few questions for her. Drupadi has put across a question. She says that she asks you, in fact, it's a question for both for you as well as Professor Bhaduri. She asks, how do privileged knowledge systems reproduce themselves in these pluriform ecosystems? Dr. Israel, if you could pick it up at first.
Can you just repeat that question, please? Because I can't find it in the chat messages.
No, she
sent it to you direct. Okay. Sure.
We have direct channel of communication. She asks, how do privileged knowledge systems reproduce themselves in pluriform ecosystems?
Okay. I would say, if you're thinking about translation and how to think critically about how translation works, then one of the ways, and what I was trying to show through my talk today, was one of the ways of doing that is by making certain claims about translation. So what I'm interested in is not whether a text was translated or not, or whether it was faithful or not. And that is the first level of engagement. But beyond that, what are the claims that are being made about what is perceived as translated and what the point of that is? So I think one of the ways in which knowledge systems perpetuate themselves is not just simply, so one level of that would be through translation itself, but the other level and the more insidious, and I would say the harder to shake off level, is when certain critical claims are made from positions of authority. So this could be either political authority, administrative authority, or even academic authority. So these are all discourses on translation and how it works that are competing with each other. So even though we find that there are different languages, there are different versions of a text that coexist, there are certain voices that are privileged in particular historical and political contexts that then whose voices or whose discourse is heard and which is given weight. So I think I would say that's kind of a short answer to the question that you've asked, Drupadi.
This question was again for both you and Professor
Yeah,
Kaduri. So
yeah,
if you could also.
So I will agree to a great extent that somehow, however pluriformal a knowledge ecology becomes, it is privileged knowledge structures that somehow find place in it. I would agree with it. I have no disagreement, because ultimately it is the Brahminical and the generally, let's say, privileged knowledge systems which find place even when we apparently pluralize our knowledge ecology. But I will not be that cynical. I will not be that pessimistic, because I believe that while indeed there is a possibility of that, but the fact that rather than a uniform knowledge ecology, we do have a pluriform knowledge ecology, that makes it possible for other knowledge systems, non-privileged knowledge systems, to also creep in. So rather than being so cynical and so suspicious and so pessimistic, I would concede that even in a pluriform knowledge ecology, privileged knowledge systems find place, but I would be more welcoming of a pluriform knowledge ecology, because the possibility of non-privileged knowledge systems finding a place in it is definitely higher than uniform knowledge ecology. So I'll be more optimistic, and translation might be a means to do that, but I would be not as cynical as the question suggests.
Dr. Israel, as you can see in the chat box, you have another question by Jayashree D, who asks about your point about the Ramayanas. Meaning making and the nation state is interesting, but is such mixing of spatial and temporal categories justifiable?
I did see that question, and I would actually like to ask Jayashree, if she's still there, why she thinks it is unjustifiable. What is it that she finds problematic about it? Because then it's easier. Otherwise, it's too general a question to respond to. Is she still there?
Yeah. Jayashree, if you're there, you could switch on your mic, or you could elaborate in the chat box.
Jayashree is there. I can see Jayashree is there. I don't know.
Okay.
Okay, maybe we can come back to her.
Yeah.
Shows she's there.
Okay. Is she there? Is she coming? Oh, no. It is a earlier point. Okay. Dr. Israel, you did talk about problematizing translation and, a more sort of addressing the question of hierarchy in translation, and sort of looking for connectivities. There is another thing that is happening nowadays, and as we question hierarchies inherent in the process of translation, there is also a certain form of revisionism that is also taking place. I mean, for example, now we see scholars coming up and saying, there was nothing wrong in Manusmriti, or the English, the English translated the text, and they simply translated it wrong. So how do we address the problem of hierarchy without falling into the trap of sort of a historical revisionism?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a good question. I think one of the reasons that I really like the approach of translation history, which is actually looking at the archives of who translated, who was involved in a translation project, which kind of language, literary, historical context, spatial context they were located in when translating, will tell us a lot about translation projects that we can use to query any such arguments that are presented. So when I was speaking about hierarchies, I was, on the one hand, what I was trying to argue was that Indian scholars, literary scholars, mostly argue that translation in the Indian context is non-hierarchical. Okay, so this is like the standard discourse on translation that is offered in opposition to what is considered as the standard Western definition of translation, which is hierarchical, which has a source and a target text as less than or is always compared to a source text. Whereas in the Indian context, the idea is that all texts have been given equal value historically, and that it continues to be given value. What I was trying to do was unpack that idea a little bit, that argument, by showing that when you do that, for certain other political reasons, that kind of democratizing of texts through translation can become problematic at other historical points, right? So that's one argument about hierarchy in translation that I was referring to. But going back to your question about how translation projects are reread, or colonial translation projects are reread, the only way to counter that narrative, I would say, is going back to the archives to see who else was involved in translation projects. From what I have seen of most texts that were translated, European scholars did not work in isolation. They actually worked with Indian scholars from specific castes, from specific contexts, from positions of authority, positions of knowledge, who had access to knowledge systems. And so what we see as a translation, what is being now argued as a wrong translation or an incorrect representation of an Indian text, was often actually the product of a combined work or a combined project between European and Indian or other, in other colonial contexts, colonial interlocutors. Okay, so it was actually a conversation that was taking place. Of course, in a lot of colonial translations, the names of Indian scholars have been either invisibilized, erased, or downplayed. And that has happened over and over again. But when the archives are looked at very carefully, you can actually trace other voices and other inputs from non-European scholars in almost all of these cases. So I would use that to argue this whole this argument that the bad colonizers came and presented us with this translation that presents India or Indian culture or ethos in a negative light.
Okay, I think there is a comment for you here. Arshit Kumar Biswal, he says these translations are not translations of the Ramayana, they are mostly retelling which take up the inherited text of the Ramayana. And each of them can't be called Ramayana, okay, because each of them have distinct names. Example, the Ramcharitmanas, which not only retells Ramayana but also is a different genre.
Okay. I don't see a question here, but I will respond to the comment. So first of all, the term retelling is a word that comes from Ramanujan's essay. Okay, and that's really important. So you've picked up on a really important point, where he is actually responding to certain definitions of translation as hierarchical by presenting retelling as as an alternative way of understanding translation in the Indian context. Okay, so it's not my vocabulary; it's actually Ramanujan's. As to whether retellings can or can't be called the Ramayana is for I would say for the audience as well as the translators to judge. So often translators will make claims to having translated a text which they may not have, or they make claims to not translating when they've actually translated. Okay, so what interests me is the discourse on translation. Why do people make certain claims rather than whether something did happen or not, or whether should we call it Ramayana or not? As a scholar, I'm interested in studying what are the repercussions of calling a text a translation of the Ramayana, or of calling it a Ramayana, or conversely not calling or not recognizing it a Ramayana. So you say, for example, the Ramcharitmanas, which not only reads Ramayana but also is in a different genre, but it doesn't seem to lead anywhere. Did you want to finish that sentence? So are you suggesting that the Ramcharitmanas isn't the Ramayana? Because I think for a whole load of audiences who would read it in Hindi, it is a primary, not only literary, but sacred text, which is read in a ritualized sacred contexts. So I'm not sure exactly what you're arguing there. But to be honest, that particular argument will take us nowhere. It will be a circular argument. Is this a translation or is it not? I mean, you can either say yes or no, depending on what your convictions are, what your religious convictions are, what your socio-political, cultural convictions are. What is more interesting is to study why certain people might want to make such a claim or not want to make such a claim.
Okay, I don't think, yeah, so we come to Professor Chandu, and she really sort of, nailed the discussions that we have been having in terms of categories and the inadequacies of categories. She sort of hit it on the nail, and she talks about ethics of encountering differences. And she also talks about organic social-linguistic plurality and categories which are effective and existential. So I would ask, since it doesn't look like anybody else, I don't think there is any question for her in the chat box. If you could just, elaborate a little bit on what you mean, how are these effective and existential categories, how are they related to our, the material conditions that we are talking about and we are, encountering right now? How do we apply, what is the point of application of this ethics of encounter now in terms of our material condition?
Yeah, I mean, in our material conditions, we are always meeting the other, right? And there is a difference between us and the other. That is what makes the other the other. Now, how do we actually deal with that difference? I mean, even if we look at our daily interactions, it is quite possible to understand how we deal with different kinds of others. And those are sediments in our minds, how we deal with A, because A is located at some caste, class, race, gender intersection, some of which we can't see. and some of which we can. Now, the reason why I called it ethical is not to do with morality. You see, the etymological meaning of ethical is proper to a place and a time. So reading is in a place and a time, engaging with a text which has been located perhaps in another place and another time. And because it is singular, obviously it is interpretable from my location. So I would prefer that we do not decide on where to slot the text. I mean, when we go in for something like a feminist reading, we have pre-decided and frozen the text where we want it to be. I mean, it doesn't matter whether I'm a feminist or not, I can still do a feminist reading. So what I'm asking for is not to look at quantifiable or geographically locatable. And I think right in the beginning, Dr. Prabha made this very important point about political South, which just shows that, you know, we are trying to reinterpret the category in order to fit it into or fit ourselves into it. The South is a geographical category. I mean, to say that political South will have to have sort of, you know, completely, I mean, I think it is a matter of mixing up the time and the place. In this case, the attributes of geography with the attributes of, let us say, affect, if for want of a better word. And as far as literature is concerned, it is affect that we are purveying in. We are really not purveying in history, because literature is possible. It is not factual, which is why I think that question about that was the direction that, it wasn't a question, it was a comment about the Ramayana. That is the direction that it was taking it in. That as a literary genre, in fact, the Ramayana, Valmiki himself, now we don't know whether there was Valmiki or not. And I'm just talking about the difficulties of, you know, categorization, when the categorization and the material that we are categorizing do not fit with each other. So Valmiki himself says, if Valmiki existed, which is another question altogether. So in the text, it says that the Ramayana is the Adhar, you know, the repository of future tales. So it's a matter of being retold again and again, but how the dots in that retelling, how the story points are connected to the plot is a literary question, a category that requires a literary understanding. Now, when we try to look at literature from the point of view of whether it is fact or fiction, I really think we are barking up the wrong tree. In fact, I think we are being made to look at this question. This is a null question as far as we are concerned. Because there is no way of proving, except the Ramayana, the existence of Ram. And the Ramayana is a literary text which does not purvey in facts. It calls itself a biography. But then a biography can be either imagined, of an imagined person, or of a real person. And there is nothing in the Ramayana itself to show that this is a real person. Again and again, it calls itself Kavya. So if we use, you know, the categories that we have received, the distinction between history and fiction will immediately undermine our reading of literature, which is why I was suggesting that we need to have affective or existential categories to understand. I mean, when you say migration, the whole point is that you're talking about human movements. And what literature gives you is the experience of that particular movement from one place to another. And you might be migrating for different things. So what categories are we going to use? Are we going to use categories that are amenable to quantifiable, factually provable, if for want of a better word, fixed and pre-decided generalized categories? Is that what we are going to use? And that I think I just used the word generalized once in the beginning. Perhaps I should have emphasized that more and talked about, what I meant by existential categories or effective categories. I think I concentrated more on what, we ought not to be doing rather than what ought to sort of come there. And the ethics is actually a demand for situated reading. I mean, at the level of reading only. Otherwise, it is something that informs our daily lives because we live in a plural society. We are encountering difference 24/7, even without being conscious of it. All I'm asking is that, we require a consciousness of the difference that we keep encountering. And that consciousness is what we can bring to our literary reading. Just as the experience that literature is trying to give us is something that we can read into the literature or out of the literature rather than a category that comes from a scientific paradigm. I mean, if social sciences can be called sciences. I mean, I know that doesn't answer your question because it was a question with that.
But just, extending, I mean, what we are doing, we are constantly questioning categories. So just to go one step further, and if we could try and problematize the category of plurality itself, this sort of an unqualified celebration of plurality. I mean, you talked about equality in difference, but can we move to a situation of equality of difference without first foregrounding the hierarchies which are there within difference? I mean, and this is something, I mean, you talked about the postmodernists, you talked about questioning of grand narrative, but hasn't the questioning of grand narrative become a narrative in itself? Sort of, doesn't it sometimes obfuscate the directionality of power, which way the power is operating, and how that power dynamics controlling even the site of plurality itself? So how do we address that?
No, certainly the hierarchy in difference is made by us. Difference exists. Difference is not, I mean, nobody is born into you're born into a hierarchy which already exists. So there is definitely a hierarchy, and I'm saying that we need to recognize where the hierarchy comes from. The hierarchy is something which is, again, sedimented. It is socially constructed. I mean, there are different ways of engaging with gender. There is gender complementarity. We know that that exists in certain areas. Even in our country, there is supposed to exist gender complementarity, or there is supposed to exist a hierarchy of genders in which the female gender is higher than the male, supposedly. So there are different ways of imagining difference, and hierarchization is only one way of imagining difference. It is not given by God, just the opposite, in fact. So that recognition is what we are asking for. And then equality of difference means that there is a kind of a democracy of language, because all of us are born with language, but it's not as if all of us are given the equal right to speak. Why not? We have the capability as human beings. It is not as if there is something automatic or something natural or something God-given that prevents us from speaking. When a hierarchy of translation or a hierarchy of languages is made, it is made by someone, as I think that was the focus of what Dr. Israel was saying. And so the first thing that we need to do is to understand that. Then we can problematize it afterwards.
Right. Okay, as you can see, Dr. Israel, Jayashri is back, and she has sort of clarified her question. So she said that where we have the choice of ideological position vis-a-vis a retelling China, but do we have it with regard to how we think of cultural memory or bhasha languages that we do derive from Sanskrit, where the influence is identifiable and not imaginary? Can we wish away hierarchies in all such domains? So if you could just take that out.
Thank you, Jayashri. That was much clearer than your first question. So I would actually challenge what you're saying about the relationship between Sanskrit and the bhashas. First of all, not all Indian languages are derived from Sanskrit. So this is again a discourse that we have accepted over several centuries. And so we assume that this is the truth about the relationship between Sanskrit and all other Indian languages. You might be aware, for instance, that the languages that are part of the Dravidian family have argued against the derivation from Sanskrit since the late 19th century. It's been a huge political question in the South. And if you're interested in the debate, you should read Sumati Ramaswamy's, what is it called? Something of the tongues. I can give you the title later, but do look up Sumati Ramaswamy's work. And think of languages that are spoken by tribal communities. Think of languages of the northeastern states of India that a lot of us scholars constantly forget the existence of these parts as politically part of India. So these actually challenge the idea that Sanskrit is the mother language out of which all bhashas derived hierarchically. Apart from this, there is a recent Sanskrit scholarship which actually tell us that there were translations out of Indian languages into Sanskrit, and that some Sanskrit texts came into a written form after their translation from an Indian language text. So if you look at that history, actually, you would say Sanskrit texts were derived from some bhashas, from oral narratives. So which comes first? I mean, of course, there's this whole acceptance of this idea that actually the Ramayana itself existed as an oral narrative tradition before it was written down by Valmiki. So once we start questioning how a certain discourse was constructed or has been accepted as a truthful discourse, then it becomes quite hard to maintain some of the claims of these discourses, which may have at certain points, certain historical times, have been beneficial to some members of the community, of the polity, let's say, at certain times. So I hope that answers your question. I'm just going to look at, yes, okay, yeah, thank you. I see, you mean some languages do, yes, but not all. So that challenges the grand narrative, doesn't it, of Sanskrit being this classical mother, essential language of India. Okay, I think Shogoto has written, I fully agree. Also,
this is, I think there was another question.
Another thread, don't worry. And while I'm still on the mic, can I just respond to what Professor Chanda just was talking about literature? Because this was something I was kind of thinking of while you were speaking. I found a lot of what you said really interesting, but I thought there were a couple of times when you posited the affective as an answer to politicized hierarchies. And it's not so much a question, but a comment where I would say that I think there is a history of the affective as well, and a politics of the affective. So I think it could be dangerous to present the affective as the opposite of all of the political narratives, etc. So I completely agree with you in all of your other readings, but just that the affective and the literary. So for instance, when you say that the literature is a response, and I get your point that it's an affective response um, to dealing with hierarchies. How do we live in a world where we are hierarchically divided? But then what is considered literature? That itself is a constructed category, right? So so unfortunately, I feel that when we do challenge categories, we almost inevitably end up with other categories that also then need dismantling, and and that is, yes, I wish we lived in a world where we didn't have to do that, but we almost always end up going around in circles about that. Okay, I'll stop here. I've spoken for too long.
Professor Chandu, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, you're absolutely right, of course, that in fact, I said that also at some point, is the entire exercise just replacing one set of categories with another. The point is, what are we deploying the categories to understand? I think that's the point. So the reason why I was talking about affective categories is because I think that the politics of the affective and not the politics of, well, I don't know what to call that, the other side. Because ultimately it is the politics of the affective that there is in a reading of literature. Because literature is affective and our reading is situated, and so is the text. So if I say that the text is situated, there is no way in which my relations of power with the world or the world's relations of power with me are going to be minused or erased from my situation. So my reading effectively is political. There is no two ways about that. However, the point that I was trying to make, and I'll kind of reiterate that again, that for material that is effective, what are the categories that we will use? Are we going to use categories that are existential, or are we going to use categories that are spatial? I mean, it's as good as asking, is Salman Rushdie an English writer because he holds an English passport? Or is he an English writer because he writes in English? And what kind of English does he write in? So is there an English or is there an Indian English? I mean, if we are talking about language, when we are talking about literature, because language is the medium of literature, it is possible to access through language. If we are talking about nation, and when we are talking about literature, that is a constructed discourse. And precisely that kind of discourse is what we are trying to dismantle. Because our idea of nation and the reality of nation, what Shogutta would call the commonsensical idea of nation, and the reality of our nation on the ground, there is such a deep misfit between these two, and we are living in that misfit at the moment. And I do not think that it behoves us to question this, because I feel that that's the way forward. So definitely there is an affective politics, and I'm glad you brought it up. It is that the category should answer the material that we are categorizing, because we can't think without categories. You see, that's the basic way in which we think, as we can't think without language. And when we think about language, we are automatically in a particular system, a particular structure, which works according to categories. So here we are looking at pedagogy, right? We are looking at praxis. How do we understand ourselves? How do we understand what we are doing?
Right. As much as we would like to continue this conversation, we are, it's about time that we wrap up. But before that, Professor Bhaduri, would you like to have any final comments, observation, response, anything?
Yeah, there was a question. I have already responded to it textually.
Yes.
Indeed, the Middle East has been under-theorized and under-talked about, whereas the Middle East occupies probably a very enviable nodal position, because both in the older terrestrial trade routes through which Europe conducted trade with Central Asia, with China, with India, the routes that Marco Polo, the Silk Route, let's say, and the later maritime routes. So in both of which, so Samarkand, Bukhara, etc., in the primary route, and in the second route, the first route, and in the second route, right from Zanzibar to let's say Yemen and Mocha, these ports, they becoming very interesting sites of intermingling and discursive generation. This is very, very important. And similarly, conversely, in the current times, in new imperialism and in new fundamentalisms, new let's say sectarian terroristic fundamentalisms, again the Middle East has emerged as one of the primary sites through petroeconomy and through Islamic fundamentalisms, etc. So the Middle East is probably the hotbed of both erstwhile imperialism, of both the waves, terrestrial, medieval terrestrial and early modern mercantile, and contemporary new imperialism and new fundamentalisms. And sadly, it is under-theorized, and probably again a rethinking of, renegotiating of post-colonialities with the objective of South-South solidarities, and the Middle East is part of the South, is part of the global South, would indeed probably also, and through a polycolonial lens probably, would indeed inaugurate the absolute necessity of incorporating, like Latin America, Africa, and Asia have been suitably brought in the rubric of global world literature studies, alternate world literature studies. So Middle East will also have to be factored in. So I've answered to that question. About affect, I mean, I am a very, let's say, pro-affect person, and I have strong positions vis-a-vis the sheer, let's say, inefficacy of ideology critique, and affect is political, but I don't want to go into that and prolong it, because Shinjini has already said that, and indeed the watch also tells us that it's quite late. But it has been a wonderful session, and it's great. I really have nothing more to add.
And thank you, Professor Bhaduri. And as you correctly pointed out, watch is telling us to bid adieu. So tomorrow, but before that, I think it has been a great session. Thanks to all the speakers, and I think where we end, it's a very significant point, that we all end, all of us, all the speakers in their own ways, they talked about point of application. Ethics is also in a way looking for point of application, and as we are reading literature, writing literature, teaching literature, most importantly in classrooms, I can see so many of my students attending this session. So there is a constant search for relevance, to make it make these texts accessible to them, and also make them understandable as in terms of how can they apply it in our contemporary situation, contemporary tumultuous political situation. So I think all the speakers, and through our conversations, we tried to steer the dialogue towards that direction. So thanks to all the speakers. Tomorrow we meet at 5 o'clock again, 5 p.m. IST. There is an academic session followed by a round table. I would ask all the participants to please try and log in before 5 o'clock. It would be helpful if it's by 4:45, because I think it would be a long day. So we should be prepared, and thanks to all. And Professor Bhaduri, I'm guessing even for a brief period of time, but we will be meeting him tomorrow, maybe for a very...
I'll be there throughout. I'll be
you
there.
Are there around.
I would love to. I won't miss all those. And today was such. And what else do we have to do? I'll be there throughout, not for a brief while.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So,
Thank you so much.
we will call it a day. And thanks to all of you again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Israel.